to worry about any conversation. First reminder, the meeting is being recorded. So before we get started, we'll do some introductions. So maybe we'll go ahead and start with the department staff. Start with Tim here and work our way around that way.
Great. I'm Tim Seymour. I'm the assistant manager for the groundwater section based out of Hamilton, Oregon.
I'm Kelly Mines. Sorry, I didn't see the direction you pointed. I'm Kelly Mines. I am a policy analyst, rural writer coordinator for the department.
I'm Ingall with the department out of Salem. I'm acting deputy director for water management, field services division administrator.
Keith Tiller, OWRD assistant water master here in Burn.
Yeah, it's been worse than enough.
Jason Street, street manager, I'm Baker City.
Great. And who do we have online for the department? Dark.
Hello in the room and online. I'm Dark Boschman, hydrogeologist out of the Salem office.
Great. And Alexandria just joined. Do we have anybody else?
Laura Hart, water policy analyst, the other rules coordinator, just kind of tag teaming and helping out Kelly today.
Great. And Alexandria, are you able to unmute and introduce yourself?
Yep, absolutely. Alexandria Scott with the Oregon Water Resources Department. I'm the engagement coordinator focused on the east region of the state, which includes the Harney Basin.
Okay, I think that captures everybody from the department that's here. Let's do the RAC members. So we'll do in person first and we'll go online.
Ken Benz,
Mark Owens.
Andy Rood, Travis Singhouse,
Laura Sissingham, Kristen Shellman, Julie Michael,
Ben McCann, Louis Mold, Steve Bergman.
Barbara Howard, Brenda Smith, Brianna O'Connor.
Okay, and online, let's see. Start with Jeff.
Morning or afternoon, everybody. Jeff Mackey.
John Short.
John Short, Water Rate Services.
Okay, did I miss anybody, any other,
Zach.
oh, Zach, I see you just joined. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, good afternoon. Zach Freed with the Nature Conservancy.
Okay, I don't think we missed anybody. So we appreciate that, everybody come, joining today again. This is a nice turnout. So let's move forward to the next slide. All right, so our goals for today. So as you all know, we're moving this along. There's some key items that we want to address today. We'll take a look at the agenda here in a moment, but building a shared understanding of proposed sub areas, explaining the data analysis used for determining groundwater level trends. And back to that sub areas one, you know, there's opportunity to really get some feedback from all of you on how those look. There was, everybody, we did share the website with a link where you could look at the different layers. So hopefully people had an opportunity to look at that in the last couple of weeks. We also have the maps here, so it breaks. We can, you know, we can zero in on some things too if you have any questions, but definitely looking for some feedback during that presentation. Then we'll move on to discussing the sub area rankings as they're being proposed and discuss the goals for curtailment and process for settling PPW. So our agenda. We get through this rough introduction, we'll get into that GIS map review. We just want to spend a few minutes on that. Revisit what was shared with you over the last couple of weeks, and hopefully all that's clear, but maybe if there are any questions, we can address that then, and then get into the sub-area discussion and any questions and feedback that you have about what's being proposed. We'll take a break, then we'll do our data discussion, share the way the data is looking and how that's being understood, the sub area rankings, and then kind of the convergence of those sub areas and that data discussion and goals for curtailment. So some big topics. We got a half hour held at the end for public comment. I'll check in at break to see how many members of the public are here that want to provide comment. That'll help us determine how we use that last half hour. If we don't have a lot of commenters, we may be able to extend our time a little bit on the curtailment conversation. All right, next slide. So just some kind of ground rules. There's some things up here on the slide which you can read, but I'll just talk through a few ideas. The opportunity here is to bring in people with different perspectives and interests and gather your input and feedback. But we need to respect everyone else's input and feedback as well. So we ask just be respectful, use appropriate language, and listen with an open mind to what other people's perspectives are in some of this. We have a big group here today. That's really good, but it's also going to be managing time. It's going to be a little more challenging. We have a pretty stacked agenda. So I just ask if you have questions or comments, try to keep them relevant to the agenda topic, right? And if they're not, I can always capture them on the flip chart. We can come back to them when it's appropriate in the meeting, but we want to try and keep the questions and comments focused on the agenda item that we're talking about, and keeping them tight. As much as possible, we want to get to the question, get to the comment, so we can give other people an opportunity to share and ask their questions and not get into too much dialogue, storytelling about what's leading to the question. Again, with this big group, we want to give everybody the opportunity to share. So if you recognize that you've been sharing quite a bit or you had a lot of questions, maybe that can peel back a little bit so we can give everybody an opportunity. The easiest way to let me know that you have a question or comment is just to raise your hand and I'll visually pick you out and I'll put you in order in my head to make sure that you get your question or comment addressed, but that'll prevent us from speaking over each other and getting too complicated. Online, ideally, you can do the virtual hand raise and I'll do the same thing so that I can then get to your questions and make sure that they're getting addressed. I prefer we don't overuse the chat online and put questions and comments in there just because I'd rather hear it from the person specifically and not have to translate it or bring it in that way. So it's just, for me as a facilitator, it's a little bit easier to not utilize that, but I recognize sometimes that's a preferred method and we'll keep our eye on that as well. Let's see. I think that's about it. Just some housekeeping, the restrooms are in the back. We have water and coffee and some snacks back there. The public comment period time is designated at the end. So we ask that the discussion and the questions and comments are limited to the members of the RAC. We'll provide opportunity to the public to make comment at the conclusion. I think that covers the ground rules. And then just operating guidelines. So this is a reminder, something we go over at each meeting, but the RAC's role, attend and participate in meetings at the square, the rectangle, or in person or online, provide input and advice and help the department consider various perspectives. Public's role is to listen only during the presentation and RAC discussions from the audience or online, provide input and advice during the designated comment time, as I mentioned. The department's role, facilitate the meeting. So that's my job. I'm contracted by the department, but I'm here as a third party neutral to manage the process. Foster collaboration, really get the opportunity to get your input and confused into what the decision making is happening here. Consider the RAC and the public feedback and draft the final rules. Okay, any questions before we start in on the overall schedule? Okay, go ahead.
All right, we've seen the slide quite a few times. So the overall schedule right now, we are currently going through our rules advisory committee process. We have RACs 5 and 6 in January and February of next year. So Happy New Year, Merry Christmas. We'll see you before then. And then that is likely to, I think it's pretty safe to say, likely that we might need more RACs. So look out for some emails from me if we need to continue on the conversation. Then after that, we plan on doing a 90-day public comment period and multiple public hearings within the basin. I'll let you know that plan was fully spelled out. And then we will bring our recommendations based off of the comments received in the public hearing as well as the RAC with the final draft rules. We'll bring it to our commission late next year for adoption. We're projecting September 2024 right now for adoption. That's likely to change right now, but this is what we have planned right now, but we'll let you know once that plan is changed. And that's all I got. That's all you guys get to hear from me today. Congratulations. Go ahead and pass it over to Kim.
I'm gonna pass around a sign-in sheet. A number of you already signed in, but a lot of people joined, so we just stick around, so we can just move it along one more time.
All right, so let me see if I can figure out how to make this happen. Yeah, so first thing we want to do is talk through the GIS map. And really the intent here is just to be an overview of how to use the map. I don't want to spend a lot of time digging into specifics on the map right at this moment. The next conversation topic will be the sub-area discussion and talking through sub-areas. But first and foremost, I wanted to make sure that everybody understood.
And, can you guys see that online?
Yep.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, sorry.
No, great, thank you for confirming. So I want to make sure people understood the map and how to use it. So some key points here. When you open the map the first time, it will display this for more information box. And here we have links to where this data came from. And you can find out more information about the individual layers by following those links. So if you want to dig more into what is being displayed, you have the access to that there. So this is ArcGIS Online. Some key features here are the layers button. In the layers button, it allows you to see all the various pieces of information and toggle them on or off. So we can toggle boundaries completely on or off. These arrows denote drop downs. So this allows you to see more or less detail, and you can toggle off individual boundaries. And then you can go through and mix and match and combine whatever pieces of information you want to see together and have that available to you. Another piece of information that's really important is the legend. So the legend is then going to give you the specific information about the layers being displayed. So in this case, when we're looking at the draft sub-areas layer, we can see what each color matches up with. So for here, this greenish color is Dog Mountain, and that matches up here. And so you can really zoom in and see, what that looks like. So that's the basics of the layers. It is possible to toggle base maps. Base maps are just the underlying map information that's displayed. So if you want more information like community map or a different canvas color, or you want imagery, or you want, I don't know, navigation, there's a whole host of different options available to you here that may or may not allow you to see additional info within the map. And these base maps are essentially fixed, and they're not, like, we didn't build these base maps. They come from the ArcGIS Online. And then you have a suite of tools like measuring and the ability to measure distances and whatnot as well. So you can use those. Hopefully many of you have used an ArcGIS Online map before and can have been able to navigate it. So of those here, can I just get a show of hands who was able to get into the map and spend some time with it? Yeah. Great. So this is available to all of you. It's public. It's available to anyone with the internet. If you don't have a good enough internet connection to be able to view the map effectively, please reach out to us. We can connect you with Dally and Cade, Watermasters here in Burns. You can come into their office. You can use their equipment, our state-provided internet connection, and you can be able to zoom in on this, ask questions, and really dig in. So any questions on the mapper or the tool we provided here? Any questions or concerns about it? All right. So let me see if I can transition back to presentation. So that's the map. So now let's get into the sub area discussion. So as we talked about in 2 RACs ago, we discussed criteria for delineating sub areas, how we actually draw lines on a map. In last RAC, we firmed up those criteria, talked about them again, presented the boundaries, the sub areas on a map. And then taking your feedback, we built the GIS map to make it available publicly so that you can zoom in, really get detail, see what that looks like. And this is just a reminder of the criteria that we've talked about. So in drawing sub-area boundaries, the 3 primary criteria we looked at were hydraulic gradient, which is the driving force of groundwater flow. We looked at groundwater level trends, which provides information on seasonal and long-term response to stresses. And then we talked about subsurface materials. So that controls the storage and the flow of groundwater. So, you know, what are the rocks that make up the ground there?
We maybe just take a quick pause right there just to find out for RAC members and first are online, you know, this is the criteria. So not diving deep into the lines on the map, but the criteria used to develop the sub areas. Any feedback about that, or is there other criteria that needs to be considered? Or questions? Awful quiet.
Was a good thing, I think, because we have talked about this twice, and so it sounds like we're making progress. Thanks, Brian.
Yep.
So the next thing before we really dig in is I wanted to walk through the documents that we have here in front of you. We sent these out with the RAC packet for members online. I posted in the chat a link to our rulemaking website where you can find these documents. The first one is the explainer of the GIS map. So this is trying to do in writing what I just did in person. So hopefully you can find this helpful as you dig into the map. The next one is the Harney Critical Groundwater Area Groundwater Right List. So there's a table on the front that summarizes some of the information about the water rights by sub-area. We had discussed this in the last RAC, putting this together. Here is the actual product that we're producing to meet that. And then if you flip to further pages, you can see the rights listed by sub-area in table format. And so you can see how many rights by sub-area, what those certificate numbers, application numbers, permit numbers, etc. are, as well as the total POU acres, which is the place of use. So how many acres can be irrigated with that right? The POD duty, which is the number of acre feet per acre that could be used. And then we have a count of PODs. So this is how many points of diversion, or in this case, wells, exist on the water right and could be used for that water right. And then there's a rate as well. So how fast you can fall. So that, a lot of information there, a lot to look into when you have time. We're not really going to use that today in our conversations, but that's there for your information. The next one is a table of authorized and actual groundwater use. Mark, did you raise your hand? Sorry, not. Okay. So summary table of authorized and actual groundwater use. So authorized use is basically a summation of the permits or the certificates, the water rights, and estimated actual groundwater right use comes from the open file report that was produced as part of the groundwater study, estimating groundwater use. And 2018 was the last year for which that was estimated in that report. So these are the 2018 numbers. One other thing to call out is that irrigation is an actual pumpage estimate, while municipal, community, and commercial / industrial are consumptive use estimates. So the consumptive use being what was actually consumed, we assume that what wasn't consumed was put back into the ground and becomes groundwater again. And so that's why it was those numbers are listed that way. And as you can see, in comparison, the water use for municipal, community, and commercial industrial is a very small proportion of the total use. The other thing I want to call out on this is specifically, is if you compare the total authorized use, which is 289,931 acre feet per year, to the estimated actual use, which is 137,000 acre feet, that's about 60% of the authorized use. So the current estimated actual use is only 60% of what is authorized in permit. And so that gives you an understanding of how authorized use stacks up against estimated use, which then stacks up against our challenge of being 110,000 acre feet over budget in the water budget. So, any questions on that document?
We'll be going through that more when we go through the agenda farther on how that data will be used for conversation.
So Dark will be getting into the data discussion, how the data analysis was put together, specifically on the groundwater level trends. We won't be talking specifically about how the water use was put together. It really is a summation of groundwater rights and a summation of the data in that open file report.
Maybe my question wasn't clear, not how the data was compiled, but how the data will be used, or we talk about possible
Yep, okay.
usage restrictions in areas.
Yeah, so Dark's gonna go through the data analysis discussion. And that is the data that we're gonna talk about and that we're going to look at using as we talk about setting the PTW. Does that answer your question, Margaret? Okay. All right, the next piece of information.
Tim, I just wanted to flag that Jerry left a comment about the 2018 use data. So I don't know if anybody's watching the chat, but just so the folks in the room are aware that there's information about the source of that data.
Yeah, so Jerry posted that this is from the OWRD OFR 2023-01 Appendix H. So if you're looking for the exact location of that information, Appendix H in that report. Thanks, Jerry. And Jerry, if you want to come on and introduce yourself really quickly as well. I think we missed you in the initial introduction.
I was having trouble connecting, so I apologize for the late connect. Jerry Grondin, hydrogeologist, groundwater section, Oregon Water Resources Department. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. All right, so the next document is the groundwater level trends, summary statistics by sub-area. This we're going to go through in depth with Dark in the presentation, so I'm not going to say much about it. He's the one that's done the work here. But this again is a text version trying to explain what we were going to talk about in this meeting in the data discussion at about 2:20. And that is, I believe, the bulk of the materials we provided ahead of the RAC to help support this process. And the reason I called all of them out is because some of the slides you're going to see in the data discussion. And as we go through here, some of those tables and whatnot are here in the information. And you should be able to, rather than looking at this screen and having to squint and potentially not seeing, you should be able to pull it up right in front of you on a piece of paper. And that should hopefully help as we have these conversations. That is that information. So, sub-area discussion. As we got to the last, or to the end of the sub-area discussion, last RAC, we asked, what do you think about the sub-area boundaries? And what feedback do you have for us regarding the number of sub-areas, the delineation of sub-areas, the criteria? Is there anything you would like to say? And many of you said, we'd like to sit with it. We'd like to spend some more time looking at it in depth, and then we'll have more to say. So now that you've had almost a month in between conversations and a couple of weeks, hopefully, with the map and these documents, we wanted to follow back up on that conversation and continue it. So questions, comments, or feedback on the sub-area boundaries as proposed?
Are they subject to change again? Are these areas that you have on these maps, are they subject to changing again?
These are our proposed sub-areas, and provided we don't have compelling reason to change them, we would not change them. But I think they're proposed, and we're open to conversation about them, so.
And that was one of the earlier questions too, with respect to the criteria that were used to establish sub-area boundaries. Are there other thoughts that you have, other pieces of data or information that should be considered when establishing these sub-areas for, long-term management for flow?
Well, maybe I'm the only guy in the room who doesn't get it, but like you take the Rock Creek North Harney, you drew my ranches into a different sub area in the middle of the sub area. We'll explain how we made that choice so I can understand. Yeah, so that choice came back to our three primary criteria. So subsurface materials, hydraulic gradient, and groundwater level trends. And then we have the additional criteria of the public land survey system sections. We wanted to keep it on section lines to make it straightforward. And this is what those data came at, this is the application of those criteria. I don't understand. I mean, like, what criteria? You know what I'm saying? I have neighbors. They didn't meet the criteria, or am I the only guy turning in measurements? So you know what I'm saying? I'm confused. I guess I don't understand what criteria did you use to draw those small sub areas inside the sub area? Yeah, so Dark and Jerry, and they missed one ranch, so they're gonna have to probably go back, you know what I'm saying? They got 3 of them, they got 1 more to go, and we'll have them all subbed out. I don't get it. Okay. So Dark and Jerry, can you help walk us through what the criteria were and how they were applied in sub areas to make these smaller sub areas?
Does everyone
I'm happy.
understand what we're talking about? Maybe we pull a map up. We could use this as an example. We don't want to drill down into dissecting one sub area, but
Well, the only place they did it is there in Crane.
okay, well, we can use it as an example to maybe help illustrate how the criteria was applied.
And maybe Dark would be more helpful if you shared your screen and presented on the map.
Sure, I can just tell you what layers to put on, Tim, since you have it there, and it should be fairly straightforward. If you zoom to that North Harney sub area.
Okay, what do you want for layers?
Let's put on the deep contours. And zoom there to North Harney. And go ahead and include Rock Creek in your extent there too. There's a little bit more of a story there. But so this is really us looking at the one criteria of the hydraulic gradient and looking at the water level contours here. It's clear that there's been significant drawdown specifically in this area. So what these concentric rings of contours mean is that we have, what we've been referring to casually as one of these cones of depression. So this area stands out against all those sections around it to the north, to the west, to the south as an area where the groundwater declines have been more severe. Now, over in Rock Creek, the story is a little different. It's not reflected well in these contours. If you'll recall, these contours represent the 2018 levels. And at that time, over in that Rock Creek, that kind of blue-gray sub area, over in that area, we didn't have water levels that were showing significant declines that indicated there were severe declines occurring. But if you look at the hydrographs for wells in that Rock Creek area, since 2018, the declines have worsened, they've quickened. And I think if we were to redraw these contours again today, we would see a significant change in the shape of those contours in that area. Now, the declines occurring in that green area, in that North Harney area, have been occurring for a longer time. The magnitude of decline is larger. But in that Rock Creek area, the rates of decline are picking up and the magnitude is going to catch up pretty soon. So there's a little bit of a difference in timing and magnitude currently between those two sub areas, but the rates are severe in both.
And Dark, this is Ivan. So I guess for clarification, these are the contours that came out of the study report and reflect the 2018 data. We've since had 5 years pass. We continue to collect additional groundwater level data. And these contours, in essence, if redone today, would be different.
That's right. These are a snapshot in time.
Is he just using the 2 wells to draw those contours?
If you put on the overlay of the wells, it'll show the wells in that.
Dark, how many hydrographs or wells do we have data for in these 2 sub areas? You got a
Wells.
ballpark?
Well, and so remember, for drawing the contours, we don't specifically need a time series hydrograph, right? We need 2018 data to draw those contours. So the number of wells that went into creating the contours is different than the number of wells, for example, that we have with long-term hydrographs or even short-term time series data. So I won't have any of those numbers off the top of my head, but I think if you scroll down, Tim, to groundwater monitoring, expand that. Let's see if we have the 2018 synoptic. Click that one on. And that gives you some sense of the distribution of those synoptic wells in 2018.
Can you see those on there? They're a little small, but.
So there's 1,
Not
2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then 7, 8 out here and 1 out here. Up there.
I would like to point out, so that those are the wells that we have identified and measured in 2018. In addition to those wells for drawing the contours, we also used the permit condition wells that are not shown on this map because they were not wells that we measured, but so the well coverage that's more inclusive would show those. And also, again, I need to emphasize that this sub area is based on, the data that was collected after 2018. So it's data that's not represented on this map.
But the hydrographs are all publicly available, correct, Barry?
Yes, they are. If you put up the wells with hydrographs coverage, we could click on some of those.
Oh, which one is that? This one. So you can see there's even more with hydrographs. You can click on one of these wells. And that's a showing contour. You can find the actual, that's the sub area. Here's the hydrograph URL. And you can say view and come look at the hydrograph. It looks like that's.
Yeah, that's only 2 data points, yeah.
Only got 2 data points.
But so we would have to go through them and see the ones that have multiple data points. But if you go up to the one where it says Corcoran Reservoir,
That
at the very north end of the sub area.
we're at the top of the blue there. Right there. East? No, there. Oh, there.
Yeah.
Okay. And we go view. Sorry, this is really hard to do.
So we have few data points, but if you look, there's almost 80, over 70 feet of decline, even just represented by that few data points. And, we questioned that quite a bit before we included the data in our analysis for that sub area. And we looked at, who was making the measurement and the reliability of that data. And because we were really reluctant to use this one, but everything kept telling us that, we couldn't ignore it.
So that's how the map can be used to really dig in and come to an understanding of what's going on in the sub area. For you, as members of the RAC. Mark.
So I am struggling a little bit with the sub areas. As we look at the map and look at more detail, thank you. I really appreciate being able to look at that. But if we have three main drainages coming in here, Silver Creek, Sylvies, Donner, and Blitzen, and we're making multiple sub areas within inside the drainages that are actually the same water, not saying the whole basin is the same water, and we're extrapolating lines off of well data, which I understand is the best data we have. But when you look at the lines, there's points of diversion that miss by 40, 50 feet. There's probably the same water rights that are separated by the line. But if that basin as a recharge area is over appropriated, every well that pumps from there is causing that over appropriation. But the sub area is segregating out specific groups of wells that are going to hold accountability for every well that was drilled in that sub basin. At first. So I'm struggling with that as far as so much extrapolated. I know that's occurring, but the brunt of the reductions are going to come from a subset of users where every well is contributing to the issue. Irregardless of priority date when you drew these maps.
Very well said.
These maps are struggling with the overall picture of trying to reach sustainability without making the burden on different individual users because they have other pivots around them. I tried to articulate that last month, wasn't able to, but I'm struggling with it.
Okay, so let me see if I understand that. So one of your concerns, it sounds like, is groundwater flow paths and recharge areas. And right, because you talked about the Donner and Blitzen and the three sort of sub areas.
Donner, Blitzen, the three main recharges coming into there.
Yeah. Yep. So then, if you were going to make a suggestion to solve that concern, would it look something like three sub areas based on those three? We'll call them sub basins for, because I think that's the word you use. So like areas that receive recharge from those areas would be grouped together. Because turning off a well in southeast of the proposed critical groundwater area doesn't help the northeast portion of the critical groundwater area, right? Because
turning a well off in Donner and Blitzen is not going to make it effective in Sylvies.
Right. So did I understand like the concern and like what a potential suggestion for solving that would be?
Possible. The USGS study brought in a water budget for every hydrological basin. I'm going to call these that you've driven administrative basins. Administrative basins that were drawn on three criteria. The main criteria I see here is the Kona depression or the lines for the water flow. Understand that's how you drew them. But I don't think that is a fair representation of what needs to happen as we go through this. I'm concerned, like I said, that the blunt of the regulation or the volunteer agreement is going to happen on a subset of people because they are within that sub area, but the well that's right outside that sub area that's still in the same drainage is contributing overall to the total decline of that water in that sub basin. Okay. Now, unless there's a geological, I know geological is one of them. We look at Weaver Springs. Weaver Springs has been identified as a very high fluid cone of cinders surrounded by more of an impermeable membrane. So that one makes sense that the water's probably not going in there, and that if you drive a well right off the side of Weaver Springs, it's probably not gonna make it affect Weaver Springs. But if you look at the North Harney, I look at Crane, the wells that are right outside the line are having just as much effect. But they missed it by 50 to 100 foot, or 200 foot, or a mile or 2 miles, when we're talking 30, 50 years to try to get this piece in that line. Okay.
So there's always, anytime you draw a line on the map, there's always gonna be people on one side or the other. And we're always gonna have that challenge. I just want to acknowledge that as like,
I completely acknowledge that, but it's still contributing to the overall deficit, because no matter what side of the line I'm on. It's going to, is one's gonna be regulated and one's not, but they're all contributing to the deficit of the water in that basin.
but I guess the last question I have, and I'm not trying to argue,
No,
I'm not trying to argue, with you. I'm thinking it through as you are. The time,
Timing is
timing is, yeah, timing is an aspect, and that's where the geologic material and the gradient and the contours help us in understanding, right? Like, because we saw in the contours around North Harney, or even around Weaver Springs, we have this very like steep cone of depression, but it's not cascading out laterally. And you have like the Upper Silver Creek, which is, up in the top left. And you have very flat contours, so you don't have a steep gradient, right? And so.
Can I contribute?
Yeah, absolutely, Jerry, go ahead.
So, your point's well taken, Mark. The, for the Upper Silver Creek and for the voltage lavas, the pumping influences are felt, over a very broad area. As you get into the Harney Valley proper, we're getting into the finer grain materials, and so we have a diversity of deposits. We've talked ad nauseum about the Weaver Springs, where you have the volcanic eruptive center surrounded by the lower permeability basin fill, and so the high production wells are in that eruptive center type of deposits, and the lower permeability material that surround it, damp, the pumping effects does spread out into those lower permeability materials, but it doesn't, it dampens that response in those finer grained sediments. There is a response, but it's been dampened. Now, for instance, up in the North Harney Valley area, as you get around the edges of the valley, you have coarse grain deposits coming off of those foothills of the uplands, and then it grades into finer and finer grain materials as you get out into the center of the valley. So we looked at groundwater flow paths, we looked at the hydrogeology, the geologic materials that were deposited, and then we looked at the hydrographs, what group of wells were showing the similar trends. Where are we going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of if we treat wells together, if we do something with this set of wells, what is going to be, who's going to be impacted in a timely manner versus those that are not so much. And so that was all factored into it, and it's hard to convey in a graphic like a map like this. And we put together our notes for each of these sub areas to kind of explain how they were put together, and I can't remember if that was put out in previous materials or not, but it's something we're more than willing to discuss. The heterogeneity of this basin On the one hand, everything's hydraulically connected, but the heterogeneity makes the response to pumping variable as you go across the basin.
Brian, I've got a.
Yeah. We had one back here, then we'll hop back. Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, I just still challenge the Dog Mountain Weaver Springs separation with what I see up there. I guess that's why I'm gonna leave it. I'm just gonna put it on the record as challenging that. I think it should be one or changed a little bit to where it's filling in all of the area that's affected. But that's where I'm leaving it.
Yeah, we'll note that again. That's kind of, we want, we don't want to drill down too tight on this, but getting this feedback is gonna be helpful that we can, can take back and consider what room there is to make some adjustments. Ivan and then Brendan.
Thanks, Brian. So I guess I've got a statement to make and then maybe a follow-up question from Mark and the group. The department's focus, if you will, and concern, we get real concerned when we see these concentric contour lines that indicate these cones of depression. It's no surprise while they're focused pumping centers. They're moving a lot of groundwater out of the system. It's not coming in fast enough. And so we get these cones of depression that are, extensive by our standards. And they're steep by state standards, meaning we've dug some big holes, some big declines in these areas. And when we look at the whole state of Oregon, they stand out as, this is a problem and we need to focus our time and energy on it. And I think that was in large part why we came up with the number of, proposed sub areas here in the basin that we did to help focus some of these sub area boundaries on these areas where we have the significant declines and where we think we want to focus our efforts on getting a reduction in groundwater use so they don't continue to get worse. Those of you who've been around for 10 years have heard me say many times, time is our friend and it's also our enemy. So the sooner we start doing something in reducing groundwater use, the better these declines will start to look. The longer we delay, the more impact we'll have, the more cost that the aquifer system will absorb. But again, the department's focus has been on these areas where we've got these depressions. And so I think that kind of helps explain at a very high level some of the reason why we have this many sub areas there, so we can focus efforts on those areas. Kind of flipping that around and getting to my question. Mark, I think I heard you say something along the lines of that if we move forward with a number of sub areas like this, a disproportionate share of groundwater use reductions is going to be carried by a smaller number of users, as opposed to more of a sub-basin type approach where we can spread that reduction in groundwater use over a larger number of users. And is that an accurate characterization, or is that one way to look at kind of what you're thinking or part of what you're thinking?
Close item. I mean, you would do it. Yeah, I mean, let's leave it at that. I'd have to give it some more thought.
Yeah, I don't need an answer, but
if we're trying to correct an issue in a whole sub-basin as a whole, but we're only focusing on certain areas, do we actually meet a goal that we all want in 30 to 50 years? Or are we just delaying? I mean, I'd have to work through it, but you're close.
And I would say that our focus on these smaller sub areas where we have big cones of depression is perhaps not going to meet a longer term goal of bringing a whole sub basin into balance with its water budget. In the short term anyways, our focus has been, let's stop this area from getting worse, to the extent that we can. So. And I'm interested in feedback from the group. Is that a good approach or not?
But Brenda,
I guess I'm, this paints the picture, it's clear that there's areas of concern. Is it limiting how we could meet sustainability by breaking them into these small pieces? In other words, can only things happen within those sub areas? I just worry that it's not like, how is that helping us get to solutions? It's painting the picture of what's happening, but I'm not exactly seeing how we start.
We'll take it.
Like, is it
limited
limiting,
options?
is it limiting our options to getting to sustainability?
Here it is.
So I would follow up on your thought and more also. And we're probably getting ahead of ourselves, but if somebody happened to be in, let's say this sub area here, which I happen to be in, and my contention would be, why don't we shut all of this wells down around the outside of it, and my water will come back inside of it, as opposed to shutting it off inside of it. And I'd be correct in that assumption. I'm gonna take 200 years or 2 million years for that to happen. But that's gonna be, that's my approach. So if I'm sitting there with a pump and there's 6 pivots right here, they're pulling the same water out that's coming down here. Right? So why, I'm gonna sit there and go, hey, wait a second. We shut off 50% of mine, this guy's still pumping all of it. And I mean, those are the problems we're gonna encounter. I mean, or carrying down, we're gonna encounter more and more type of storms.
Okay, no, that's helpful, thank you.
So in a way to characterize that is it can create conflict.
Well, it's gonna create conflict, and it's also, you're gonna say, hey, listen, we know it's that part, all the water's going the same place. The same thing with what Andy's asking, is that water's, yeah, there's a cone of depression right there, but the water, if the less water is being taken out outside of that, it would be pushing into that to help alleviate that problem. So certainly, I mean, because at the end of the day, those of us that are pumping water are sitting there going, when are we gonna get it and what is gonna get shut off? I mean, that's what we think about. So because it's, I mean, because that is eventually gonna happen.
Yeah, Kristen here, and then we try to keep you questions for the RAC members who love public comment at the end, unless you're on the RAC.
I just kind of have a clarifying question first. So when we're looking at these sub basins and kind of like in Andy's situation where he's bringing up, that there's some that are broken out much smaller. Obviously, there's justification for that, but are we stating that is coming from the same water table? Are there any differentiation in water table within each of these? Obviously, there's different well depths within the county. Is there anything in what the department and the USGS studies are saying that differentiates any water tables? Are we all, when I see this, am I looking at it that those are all coming out of that same water table within that same proposed sub area?
Well, I'll let Tarek and Jerry jump in. The contours reflect either the shallow system. We've got 2 separate contours from the study, either the shallow wells, the shallow part of the system, or the deeper part, which is where I think the majority of the production wells are at. Tarek, Jerry did for the sub area criteria there, were any of the shallow levels looked at, groundwater level data? Was that part of the analysis too, or I don't know?
Yeah, it sure was. In certain areas, it becomes more important. Now, as far as the geology goes, these sub areas do not in any way represent separate aquifers in any sense. And I've tried to get this point across as hard as I could in my last presentation a month ago, and even before that we're dealing with a continuous groundwater flow system. There are no known barriers to groundwater flow, and that makes drawing sub-area boundaries especially challenging, right? And so there were cases where the geology is a big factor, and I think Mark mentioned Weaver Springs is a great example of that, where we've got this great concentration of high permeability cinders surrounded by these low permeability sediments. But you start moving up into the Harney Valley, and you pretty much have a big thick sequence of sedimentary rocks with variability all throughout there. Of course, we have to recognize that. But it's all the same hydraulically connected groundwater at the end of the day, if you're out there in the middle of the Harney Valley. So, some of these smaller sub areas, the way we've delineated them, primarily using the contours, and what we're doing there is we're encircling that group of wells that's pumping down the groundwater in that area to cause those contours to look the way they do.
Zach has his hand up online. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this discussion. I've been thinking a bit myself about the trade-offs between more smaller sub areas versus fewer larger sub areas. And I understand the philosophy and the criteria that are being described for how Jerry and Darek delineated these. From a super pragmatic standpoint, what are the benefits and the downsides of having more sub areas? Does that increase the management flexibility for voluntary agreements? Does it increase the options available for curtailment? Are there downsides? Does it increase administrative burden? Like having 15 different sub areas to manage might be more difficult than having 5 or 3. So I appreciate all this discussion about why the sub areas are there. Can somebody tell me more about what are the pragmatic, in practice pros and cons?
Yeah, Zach, I'll try to take that one. So what we've talked about a lot is sub areas allow us to focus our reductions in the places of most severe decline. And with limited staff resources and time, we're essentially pragmatically trying to triage and slow declines in the areas of severe decline. So that's probably our first and foremost pragmatic reason for smaller sub areas. The second pragmatic reason is that these sub areas, as we've talked about previously, could provide a framework that limits transfers. So transfers of groundwater rights within sub areas would be allowed, and out of sub areas would not. The reason being, we would consider the sub areas the same source of water, and going from an area of high declines to an area of low declines simply moves that pumping effect from one point location to another and out of one sub area into another. So that's another really pragmatic reason. Another pragmatic reason is that I think generally we believe, and we may be completely wrong on this, but smaller sub areas means fewer users grouped together. And when trying to get to some sort of a consensus decision, those are generally easier with smaller people. I don't think I've ever been in a meeting with 5 people and thought to myself, you know what we need here to make a decision is another 20 people. And so that's another really pragmatic reason for smaller sub areas. And those are the big 3 right off the top of my head.
Okay, Mark, and then
Thanks.
Go ahead. I guess my question is to Jerry. So is Jerry there?
I'm here.
Okay, so if we turn, this is Andy from out the north where all the problems are. If you turned all the water off south of me, then my problems would go away, correct?
Well, I wouldn't say that, because if you can scroll the map a little bit.
Yep.
So there you go. So, for instance, the cone of depression in the North Harney, so we've got this cone, and it reducing the pumping outside of that cone doesn't do much to benefit what's going on within the center of that cone. And that's why we broke out Rock Creek separate from that Upper Harney Valley sub-area. And so, it's a similar kind of a deal. What's going on within Rock Creek, is a rather recent, development post 2018 primarily. And, the development, south of you, we could kind of look, get down and with the specifics and see whether or not we need to extend the boundary further south or not. If it's contributing to the problem, maybe we should. And that's why we're having these discussions. But this is our first cut at it. And because we discussed at length whether or not Rock Creek and the Upper Harney should be a single sub area or not, as well as we had long conversations about Dog Mountain and Weaver Springs being a single sub area or not. In the case of the Crane, initially we did have them as two sub areas, and then we realized that no, we can justify having it as a single sub area. We wrestled with each of these, but we tried to follow the data as best we could. But if there's adjustments that we need to make, we're willing to listen to them.
Well, I was just confused because, the water's connected together, so the more you turn off to the south, the more it's gonna come north. I mean, right? Am I correct? Isn't it all one backup? Yes, so.
Well, yes and no. So for instance, that North Harney area, and Steve describes this in the USGS report. So we've got groundwater flow that's been reversed in that North Harney area, instead of going south to Malheur Lake, the water is now being captured as it comes out of the foothills in that cone, and water is flowing from the south to the north back into that cone. And you don't start picking up the gradient back towards Malheur Lake until some miles further south. So, you do have pumping south of that cone of depression, but it's not having the impact. Granted, those pumping are changing the gradient to a certain degree, but not as much as what we're seeing right there in the heart of that cone of depression.
Is it fair to say, Jerry, that a cone of depression indicates a place where water is not able to move laterally as quickly as we are able to pump water down? Right, the water level is dropping because we're moving water out rapidly, and the water is not able to flow in laterally efficiently enough to keep up with the amount of pumping.
Yeah, the reasons why water can't refill the cone as fast as is being removed, there's no single reason. You kind of have to take it on a case-by-case basis. But in general, you're correct.
Yeah, I want to do a quick check-in here. So we're about 5 minutes left on this agenda item, but there's an important one. I don't want to sell it short. Mark has a comment here. We'll go to that. And I guess what we want to try to make sure is, I think using these specifics are good ways to understand it. But we don't want to go down that rabbit trail of trying to dissect each one of these, because I think there's probably willingness, I imagine, from the State Department to have some one-on-one conversations with folks about those, drilling down on some of these sub areas to understand the borders.
Thanks. So Tim, your 3 pragmatic responses, we might have a different definition of what pragmatic means. Saying that the resources available to the project is one of the reasons we're going to move forward in this direction, I think is objectionary to the community.
Okay.
This should not be resource constrained when we're trying to figure out how we can get to the best solution for this community, unless the object is just to go to a regulatory fashion, which has failed the department in the past. If we're actually going to try to achieve a volunteer agreement, which is the only other way in statute that you can get to regionally stable, that shouldn't be part of the conversation. I know you're a regulatory agency, it has to come up. Let us deal with that. Don't let that be a limiting factor to what gets presented in this RAC, please. Always have that caveat. Secondly, I do think that the smaller subbasins will actually stifle some of the options for volunteer agreements. Like a declining water market, a water share, the flexibility in transfers. If we desire to get the most economic input out of every unit of water that we're going to be available to pump as we reduce usage, that water's going to have to go to the best land. It's going to have to be not constrained by administrative areas of a cone depression. We're going to have to get the best economic value of that water throughout that whole sub-basin. The sub-area delineation doesn't allow that to happen. I could probably come up with one or two more. If you allow users within a sub-basin to enter a volunteer agreement collectively together, maybe it's not all of them. But maybe there's some opportunity to have some pilots early than forcing those that would have to work together.
Okay. So on the voluntary agreement piece, having more people is a good thing.
Not necessarily, but
Because, well, can I, yeah, sorry, I'm trying to puzzle.
yeah, you're thinking out loud. I understand that.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot too.
Otherwise, it's really awkward as I sit here silently. Having more people you may not end up at 100% agreement to the voluntary agreement. But you could end up with a large enough agreement that we get to some sort of threshold that it achieves the goal without including everyone. Is that what I heard?
Yeah, without taking a lot more oxygen in the room, we're going down this similar path.
I will say, I hear you loud and clear that smaller sub areas likely means more conflict. Smaller sub areas means more lines on the map to look at and see, well, why did this person end up on this side versus that side? I hear that loud and clear. I think again, I'll come back to timing of impact. As we're talking about cones of depression, like these are forming because lateral movement of water is not happening fast enough to fill in for the pumping effect in that area. And so the pumping in that area is responsible for that deepening of the water level. And that's been part of the focus. So, yeah.
All right, we've got just a couple minutes left, so we got two more people that have comments. To see you there, John. We're gonna do those two, question or comment, try to keep them quick, and then we will move on to a break. Go here first and then go to John.
Well, I'm concerned that, I think the department's done a good job in breaking these out into smaller units personally. And how that's handled afterwards is another question. But there's a lot of diversity, and the assumption that all the water is connected really hinders in doing a good job of administering the water, because there is great diversity. As you move south, and I'm not talking about rattlesnake much, I'm just looking at on areas that I'm more familiar with, that you can look at it the other way, that the people that aren't, and I think the department's looked at it that way, but that aren't having a big decline, it would be paying with penalty for assuming, especially in these tighter soils, water water regulation, and assuming that it's going to substantially help the declining areas. So I have that's why I've always come back to the quality of data and the data over time part. That's why you've heard me say it over and over again, 12 years of data. And when we're talking about 2018, if there's a discrepancy in an area, the way to solve it is better and better data over time. That's just, we'll always come back to, and that's what we do on our own irrigation. We monitor the wells we're not even using. We monitor 11 wells in a little area, because there is diversity even in that area. So, I understand the points that are being made, but there is a number of little different flows in it. I know a little bit about that area, but on to the south, there's some major flows coming together, and I think the sub areas that are defined on it partially to capture it. We might find out there is too much diversity in there as we collect data on down the road. So I'm not pushing back on everybody on this, but I'm saying that I've talked to quite a bit of people out there, and they're concerned about when they're not getting a decline and they're not that far away, whether it's a sub aquifer or that you got a big clay layer that very little water passes one way or the other, then that has to be considered.
Good, thank you. All right, John, final bit of feedback on this.
Yeah, I simply wanted to expand a bit on what Mark said as to limiting transfers and things being the same source, and how, I don't know where things are headed as to how to respond to these, but when we have these little sub areas like that Upper Harney, if that is different than Poison Creek and Rattlesnake, then normally I'd have to tell whoever that client is, well, you're screwed. You can't move your water rights out of that little area. So it certainly limits options for people in those small areas, as far as what is the same source. Just we can't transfer them very far. That's just life.
Okay, thank you, John. All right, so let's again, recognizing this is a critical component to the conversation, but we also have other items we want to address today. I've captured notes here about your feedback. I think the way the path forward on this topic will be that feedback. The department will bring that in. We will take some time at the next meeting to respond back and show what, how that was considered. If there's some changes that are made based on that input. Transfers is also another big piece of that. It's come up a little bit. We don't want to dive into that right now because that's, I think, a conversation that warrants time dedicated to it. So that's another piece that we could look to adding to the agenda to have a deeper discussion on it next meeting in January. So it's all fluid. We're still moving along, but I think this has been helpful feedback. It's going to ideally get this to a place that people are agreeable to. So we wanted to take a 10-minute break. It's 2:13 now, so we'll get back at 2:23. So it's right after the 2 mark.
Kelly, I'm meeting over the room. Okay, please. Just make sure.
You guys just mute. I'll leave the recording on.
Okay, so as promised in the last, we alluded to this, but we're gonna drill down a little bit more into the data at this point, so. Dark is gonna present that, and we got the presentation ready to go, so I think we can get going.
Let me make sure. All right, Dark, I think you're up.
Okay, are you seeing just my presentation slide there?
Says groundwater level trends, data and analysis.
There we go. Okay, well, last time we met with the RAC last month, we heard quite a bit of interest for a more in-depth discussion on our groundwater level data and the types of analyses we're using to evaluate the water level trends across the basin. So the goal of this presentation today is to provide some additional background on the groundwater level data itself and the specific methods we're using to analyze that data to calculate our water level trends. So real quick, just a summary of what I plan to cover. We'll discuss our groundwater level data and the OWRD groundwater level database. And as a part of that, I'll also cover some of the common issues we encounter with groundwater level data and provide some discussion on the types of review we go through to ensure that data is reliable and appropriate for the kinds of decisions we're making here in the basin. We'll discuss the specific types of calculations we use to evaluate groundwater level trends, and I'll provide some details on some other important items that must be considered when interpreting these groundwater level trends. And finally, we'll take a look at how the groundwater level trends are variable across the basin. That's differences between the different subareas, as well as the variation that exists within the individual subbasins themselves. So groundwater level data here at OWRD is maintained within our groundwater information system, otherwise known as the GWIS database. This database includes groundwater level data collected by OWRD staff and USGS staff, as well as data that we receive reported to the department through the permit condition program and other voluntary sources. So on the right here is just a screenshot of a groundwater level table from GWIS. This database includes a lot of information, including the date and time, the measurement, the method of measurement, the status of the measurement, whether it's static or rising or pumping, and the name of the individual who made the measurement. So here is just an example of a hydrograph for one of our observation wells. Just to orient us here to these types of figures, we'll be looking at a lot of these throughout the presentation. This particular well is equipped with a data logger that logs the static water level every hour. So we get this nice continuous record of water level change over time. One thing that's very important when looking at hydrographs is to recognize the scale on both the X and the Y axis, which is often going to be different for each of the different hydrographs you might be looking at. So in this case, the X-axis here is time in years from 2017 to 2024. And the Y-axis is groundwater level elevation, in this case, represented in feet above mean sea level. So you'll notice that the scale on the Y-axis covers a range of about 10 feet. And there's a 2-foot difference between each of the horizontal grid lines. This scale is going to be different. Most likely, any different hydrograph you see, you've got to evaluate the labels on the Y and X axis if you want to be able to compare one hydrograph to the next.
Mark, can you just share real quick the numbers? Some folks you can't see in this little font.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so here is the groundwater elevation here at the bottom is 4078. This is 4080, and it steps up by 2 up to 4088. So that's elevation above mean sea level. And then this spans from, just before 2017 here up to our 2023 measurement.
Thank you.
Dark, can you touch on the manual measurements versus the transducer data?
I can, and I apologize, they're the same color blue here, but these point measurements here, these blue dots represent when staff went out and actually put the E-tape down the well to measure manually the depth of water. And these more continuous blue lines represent the logger data, that hourly data that the logger is recording. Okay. So this hydrograph really illustrates the type of groundwater behavior that we expect to see and that we do see in the Harney Basin. So drawdown occurs over the summer months. That's going to be this part of the curve here. And then that's the time of year when recharge is low and pumpage is high. And then we hit this low point here and recovery begins to occur. This is at the end of the irrigation season. Once the pumpage stops, recharge begins to occur during the wet season. That's this upward curve. And the hydrograph peaks each year in the spring before falling again at the start of the next irrigation season. So that's this summer irrigation season dropping down into the next year. So this is the kind of up-down seasonal cycle that we see really across the basin, and is represented by most of the hydrographs. Specifically when we have this type of continuous data, we really see a clear pattern, and that's the expected behavior that we see out in the basin. And like I said, these types of seasonal and interannual patterns are typical, and they're predictable to a certain extent. So when we see patterns or trends that fall outside of this expected behavior, we have to ask ourselves, what's going on? Is the unusual behavior a result of some natural groundwater conditions, or is something else going on to explain that? So that brings us to our groundwater level data review process. So the groundwater section periodically reviews the data in GWIS, both the data collected by OWRD and data submitted to the department from various sources. We go through the quality control review process to ensure that all of the data is reliable and suitable for our purposes, in our case of making groundwater management decisions here in the Harney Basin. So over the years, the groundwater section has identified several common ways in which issues can arise with our groundwater level data. I'd say by far the most common issue we encounter is misidentified wells. This is where water level data measured at one well are reported as corresponding to the incorrect well. And this results in measurements in the database associated with the wrong well. And in some cases, measurements from multiple different wells are reported under the same well ID. And this is an issue that I struggle with, that anybody out identifying wells in the field is going to struggle with. Most of our newer wells, you can see here on this picture, here we've got a well tag on this well. It's going to be pretty easy to know what the driller's well log is for that well. But that's not always the case. And in many scenarios, you may have, half a dozen wells in a quarter section with no well tags. And it's very, very difficult to identify which specific well you are at. And so unfortunately, we see this over and over again in the database. And we've got to try to sort through that to make sure that the measurements on that hydrograph actually correspond to the well we're trying to represent. Another big issue is turbine oil. So it's another common problem that if we don't recognize it when we're in the field, can result in erroneous water level measurements. Typically what happens is the probe of your E-tape, as you lower it down through the turbine oil, gets coated. The electrodes can't complete the circuit once they get into the water. And it's only once that oil is rinsed off and you're a ways down into the standing water in the well that the beep occurs. So pretty common that we see measurements that are just too deep. They're just below where the actual static is. So this issue can be overcome with great care in the field, but too often it's not recognized at the time the measurement's being made. Another issue that we have both internally and we see it in our reported data is that anytime you have multiple people visiting the well site, especially for the first time, we see an increased likelihood of problems entering our water level database. And this is only for the fact that it's more likely that a well will be misidentified if you haven't been to the well before, or that you won't recognize that turbine oil is an issue in that well if you've not encountered that specific well prior. So Here are just some example hydrographs of the types of things we're looking for when we review the groundwater level data in GWIS. Each of these hydrographs show data points that fall outside of that natural variation that we expect to see here in the Harney Basin. So for each of these, we would go to the water level record in GWIS and review the details of each measurement. We'd first ask ourselves, is there some natural process that can explain these measurements? But more likely, what we would find is some evidence that these measurements are not associated with the correct well. So we would see things like inconsistent measuring points, measuring point heights. We'd see that there's been numerous people reporting measurements for the same well. And then in some cases, we can verify that there might be a history of turbine oil in the well that might explain what we're seeing here in the data. So if there are inconsistencies or other evidence to suggest that these measurements are unreliable, we can flag them in the database so they're not used in the evaluations. Again, we really want our groundwater management decisions here to be based on the best data we have available. And that's data that accurately reflects groundwater conditions and not data that might be, for a variety of reasons, unreliable. So I have prepared a few examples of specifically what the review for each of these might look like. And I have those slides at the end of the slide deck. If there's time and interest, I'm happy to step through those here at the end. And I'll pause there before I move on to the calculations just to see, ask for questions or feedback, comments on that piece.
Dart, could you just go back to that previous slide and point out the level of, like, the magnitude of error on some of those? Like, we're talking about 30 feet, right? Or potentially more.
Let's see. Yeah, so this is 4120 down to 4095. So that's, over 20 feet. This one is 40 feet in 2 years. Not the type of variation we tend to see in these particular areas. Here we go, 4060 up to 4160, 4180. So that's over 100 feet of difference on those. This situation here is a little different, where we just seem to have 6 measurements in a row that are identical to the 100th of a foot. So something else is going on in that case. And like I said, we can step through specifically what the review process for these would look like if there's interest at the end. But we've got a lot to get through here, so we'll see what kind of time we end up with here. Okay. So now that we've identified the data set we're working with and we're feeling comfortable that the data we have is reliable, how do we approach evaluating that data for trends? So we've discussed this now a number of times, that we're looking at 2 primary groundwater level trend metrics, and these are groundwater level decline magnitude and groundwater level decline rate. I'll go into each of these in more detail in the coming slides, but briefly, for magnitude, what we're talking about is the total groundwater level decline over the period of record, and this is measured in feet. This is shown schematically in this line here, and specifically this line here. So it's pretty much the highest to the most recent. For rate, what we're talking about is the rate of groundwater level decline from year to year, which is measured in feet per year. And that's shown schematically here, represented by this line trending down. One really important consideration here is that we're always trying to look at the annual high measurements, which are generally the spring high measurements in the January to April timeframe. What we're trying to avoid is the influence of the seasonal drawdown during the irrigation season. Again, that's this part of the hydrograph, this summer irrigation drawdown. We really want to compare the annual high from one year against the highest level to which groundwater recovers prior to the next year's irrigation season. And so for each of these calculations that we're going to look at, these are the measurements we're focused on. So we're looking at this annual high to this annual high to this annual high, and trying to avoid the influence of these summer seasonal drawdown trends. So let's look a little closer at how we calculate the decline magnitude. There are a few parameters we have to specify to make these calculations. And there's a few ways, we could approach this, but our approach here is to calculate the decline magnitude from the highest measured value to the most recent annual high. In addition, we've specified that the most recent annual high must be in the range 2016 to 2023. And this is because we want to be sure that the results reflect the magnitude of decline up to the most recent period of years. So we're not as interested, for example, in the decline magnitude that might have occurred between 1980 and 1990. We really want to make sure we're capturing in our evaluation the magnitude of decline up to this most recent period of years. So when we specify that parameter, that age, that date range, what that means is wells that don't have measurements after 2016 are simply not included in the evaluation and in the data that we're going to see here in the coming slides. And of course, we've discussed this piece a number of times. The overall period of record for the calculations, for these magnitude calculations in particular, is critical for being able to understand what the values mean. And we'll get into some specifics on that and take a closer look once we get into the sub-area comparison. So here is just a simple example for calculating groundwater level decline magnitude. In this case, the first available annual high was in 2017, and it had an elevation of 4087.8 feet. And the most recent annual high is here in 2023 and had a groundwater elevation of 4082.5 feet. So it's really just a matter of simple subtraction. And for this well, we end up with a decline magnitude of 5.3 feet from 2017 to 2023. Really pretty straightforward for decline magnitude. Moving on to groundwater level decline rate. Here again, there are various ways to establish a trend among a set of data points. The approach we've chosen to use here is called the SENS slope. And this approach is, the SENS slope is a robust method of determining slope via the median of the slopes of all the lines that can be drawn through the data points. Now, it's hard to describe in words what that means. And again, if we have time and there's interest at the end of the presentation, I do have a set of slides where we can step through an example of how this calculation is made. But for now, what I'll say is that the major advantage of the SENS slope is that it's straightforward to calculate and that it's insensitive to outliers. So if there's interest in time, we can step through an example specifically of how that's calculated, but it will take up a bit of a chunk of time. So for the parameters for making this calculation, again, another consideration is the period of years over which we're going to calculate that rate. So we're most interested in knowing what the decline rate is now, today, or over the most recent period of years. And you can see from this hydrograph here that, the rates of decline have changed over time. So we're not interested in what the rate of decline was back in the late 80s. We're interested in the rate of decline now. So for our calculations for this data set that we'll be looking at, we've specified that we're only going to be looking at data in the range 2016 to 2023. And again, wells that don't have data in that range will not be included in the evaluation. So those are the two metrics and our two approaches for calculating them. But before we move on to the sub-area comparison, I just want to provide some additional items that we have to keep in mind when evaluating these types of groundwater level trends. And I want to try to illustrate these for you here. The first is just the simple example of the importance of understanding the period of record for any individual well. And this is specifically when it comes to the decline magnitude values. So on this hydrograph here, we actually have water level data for two wells plotted on the same plot. The first has a period of record from 1993 to 2023. That's this blue line. And the second has a period of record only from 2017 to 2023. And that's that red line down in the bottom right. So clearly we can't make an apples to apples direct comparison between these two decline magnitude values. That decline value of 42 feet in that red hydrograph just fails to account for the previous decades of decline that have occurred in this area. So any evaluation of groundwater level decline magnitude has to take into account any longer-term declines that may have been occurring in that area. And for any given value of decline magnitude, you really have to understand the period of record to put it into that context. So generally, wells with a longer period of record are going to do a better job of capturing the overall magnitude of decline. This is one I think we all kind of understand. It's a matter of being able to dig into that well-specific history to be able to understand what that magnitude value actually represents. So here's another consideration, and we'll look at the impacts of well construction and specifically well deepening in this case. So here's a hydrograph of a well that was deepened in 2016. And you can see that when the well was deepened from 250 feet to 500 feet depth, that there was a water level drop at that time of over 40 feet. So this issue is especially important to recognize in areas where we have significant vertical hydraulic gradients. And, in this case, this is an example of a decline magnitude that we wouldn't want to include in our evaluation, as this would overestimate the decline that's directly resulting from the pumping in this area. And finally, let's take a look at how our parameter selection for the calculations can impact the results depending on the available period of record for any specific well. So you'll remember that for the decline rate, we've decided to only consider measurements in the range of 2016 to 2023. We're only interested in what the decline rate is in this most recent period of years. So here's an example of a well that happens to only have 2 measurements in that evaluation window after 2016. And because of this, the rate is only calculated over those last 2 measurements, which in this case, because of those last 2 measurements, results in a positive rising trend. Our send slope rate is actually rising because the measurement for 2023 was higher than the measurement for 2022. Even though if you look at the overall hydrograph, the magnitude of decline is over 80 feet since 2011. So this is just an example of an unfortunate result of how our parameter selection can interplay with this particular water level record. If there were additional measurements in that 2016 to 2020 range, the calculation would do a better job of reflecting the declines that actually occur here. So, the main point I want to make with these examples, these other considerations, is that the magnitude and rate values cannot always be properly evaluated without understanding and evaluating the context of the specific water level measurement history, as well as any construction history that may impact the results of the calculations. But I'd say in most cases, these calculations and the parameters that we selected result in meaningful results that represent the true groundwater conditions. But there are always going to be situations where the resulting values can really only be understood after further evaluation of other details. I will pause there because we're going to move into another section here shortly and see if there are questions, feedback, concerns up to this point.
It's all clear.
I see Zach's hand up. Please, Zach.
Yeah, just a quick question, Darek. Did you use a minimum amount of points to calculate send slope?
We did not.
Okay,
So,
got it. Thanks.
Yep. So, well, 2 points, I guess, would be the minimum. So at this point, we'll pivot from that general conversation about data and how we evaluate it to the specific conversation around how these decline trends vary between the 15 sub-areas and what kind of variation we see within the individual sub-areas. So here again, just to review, is our sub-area map and the list of 15 sub-areas. Before we jump into the data, I just want to go through this one review slide to help us get through the rest of the presentation. The next handful of slides are going to include a type of graph shown here called the box whisker plot. And I just want to make sure we can all understand what these plots are telling us as we look at them. So a box and whisker plot is a graphical method of displaying variation in a set of data by showing how the data is distributed and identifying any outliers. The plot is made up of a box, this box here, and lines extending above and below the box, which are referred to as whiskers. The plots show 7 statistical values that help describe the variation within the data. The median is shown by this horizontal line within the box. 50% of the data is greater than the median, and 50% of the data is less than the median. The average is shown by the X, seen here. The upper quartile is the upper extent of the box, and this represents a point at which 25% of the data is greater than this upper quartile. The lower quartile is the lower extent of the box, and 25% of the data is less than the lower quartile. The box itself represents what's called the interquartile range, and that is just the middle 50% of the data. And the minimum value excluding outliers, the maximum value excluding outliers is this upper whisker, and similarly, the minimum value excluding outliers is this lower whisker. Outliers are depicted by these dots above and below the whiskers. And in these plots, any data value that is greater than 1.5 times the interquartile range, either above the upper whisker, either above the upper quartile or below the lower quartile, is considered to be an outlier. And without getting too much into the weeds on that, I'll just say that this approach for determining outliers is a standard statistical method in this type of evaluation. Okay. Let's jump into the data.
Yeah, I just want to pause real quick just to reaffirm that as we look at this, we're looking at the subregions as they were presented earlier. We got a lot of feedback about subregions, so we'll need to keep it within that context for the presentation, but there's going to be further evaluation of those subareas. And one more. Before we move forward, I want to make sure kind of gauge how many people are interested in public comment. Any members of the public here in the meeting room were interested in providing public comment at the conclusion? Okay, and anybody online that's a member of the public that's interested in providing public comment, could you virtually raise your hand and I'll count that up. Okay, thank you. All right, let's move forward.
Okay, and I realize we're probably getting a little crunch for time, so I'll push on.
Sorry, I wanted to make sure you saw Chris Hall's hand. I don't know if you were taking some. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
So first, let's look at groundwater level decline magnitude across our 15 subareas. The map here on the left shows the distribution of decline magnitude values across the 15 subareas. Warmer colors indicate higher values of decline magnitude. The table here on the right summarizes the decline magnitude values by subarea. And I'll point out in these tables that negative values indicate a declining trend. So the minimum magnitude column represents the greatest overall decline. And I'll point out too that the number with the N equals after the subarea name is the number of wells evaluated in each subarea. So you can see from the map and in the table that the higher magnitude values tend to be concentrated in a few subareas. And we'll take a closer look at the subarea comparison in just a bit, but before we do, just a note here on the period of record. So as we've discussed, it's critical to recognize the period of record to understand these decline magnitude values. And so this table here summarizes the periods of record available for each subarea. And you'll see in the table that in each subarea, there are some wells with a very short period of record, in some cases just 2 measurements over 1 year. And there are some wells with much longer periods of record, over 60 years in some cases. But the average and median columns here can provide some sense of kind of the typical period of record available for wells in each subarea. So in general, again, the takeaway on this period of record issue is that you have to evaluate this period of record to really understand how the decline magnitude value can compare to the other wells in that area. So let's move to our first box and whisker plot. So this is the box and whisker plot for groundwater decline magnitude by subarea. The subareas are listed here from left to right in order of the median decline magnitude, from the most severe median decline magnitude on the left to the least severe median magnitude on the right. I'll just zoom in here to make it a little bit bigger, so hopefully we can see it. It is also in the RAC packet handout, hopefully in front of you. So again, these box and whisker plots also illustrate the variation in values within each individual subarea. And we can see that some of the subareas have considerable variation in decline magnitude within their boundaries. But overall, looking at this comparison plot, it's fairly clear that a small number of subareas have seen more significant overall declines than some of the others, most notably Weaver Springs, and North Harney, Crane, Lawn, and Dog Mountain also includes wells with some fairly significant magnitudes of decline. So moving on to groundwater level decline rate. The map here on the left again shows the distribution of decline rate values across the 15 subareas. Warmer colors again indicate higher values of decline rate. And the table here on the right summarizes the decline rate values by subarea. Again, recognizing that negative values indicate a declining trend. So this minimum rate column here on the left represents the fastest rates of decline. Again, we can see from the map and from the table that the higher decline rate values tend to be concentrated within a few of our subareas. So let's move to the box and whisker plot. Again, the subareas here are listed from left to right in order of the median decline rate, from the most severe median rate on the left to the least severe on the right. And we'll blow it up full screen again for us. We can see that, again, some subareas have considerable variation in decline rate within their boundaries. But overall, it's fairly clear that a small number of subareas are experiencing more significant rates of groundwater level decline than some of the others. Notably Weaver Springs and Rock Creek, but also Lawn and Dog Mountain include wells with significant rates of decline. So I know that was a lot and it went on for probably longer than I even had planned, but here are the kind of main points that I hope we can take away from all of this. First, the GWIS database includes groundwater level data from multiple sources, and that data is reviewed periodically for quality control. Second, to understand the decline magnitude and rate values, we have to understand the parameters that are specified to make the calculations. And in some cases, we'll need to review the well measurement and construction history to fully interpret what the values represent. Number three, there are variations in both the decline magnitude and rate within each of the 15 subareas. And finally, a small number of subareas have decline magnitudes and rates that stand out as more severe problems than some of the other subareas. So again, I know that was a lot, but I'm hoping we can spawn some discussion, and at least some of that helped clear up some of the questions you might have had or generate some new ones, and see if we have some time to discuss those now.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So, yeah, questions for Derek about the data. So, I mean, he sort of was hinting at the next agenda item, which is subarea rankings. So if you have questions about that, that's what we're getting into a little more depth now. But questions about the data that drove that is really what's where we want to zero in right now. Yeah, I'm not seeing any online or in the room.
Is this information helpful, I guess, is another question. Yeah, Mark?
Yeah, I do, and it might have, thanks, Dark, for doing some work for some of the questions that I had. Appreciate that. I mean, it does, to me, when we're talking the magnitude of decline, and you look at the chart, I'm gonna pick on Crane, Crane has a larger magnitude at 22 years, so therefore it could have a larger magnitude decline. But you look at the rate of decline, it's in the middle 50% set on each side. So I mean, it does help me process. Last meeting, you showed some data points that I hadn't seen before. Wells in some of the areas that had dropped over 50 foot. That's what I was reactionary on, wanting to know what was the period of record for some of those wells. Understanding how you compile these and average them, it does help.
Excellent. And a reminder that the map he showed with the different gradation of colors is a layer available in the public map that you can go turn on, zoom in and look at. So. Anybody else? Is this helpful? Is there anything we can do better, Fred?
How will longer term data be used? And you're talking about 2016 or whatever it was to 23.
Yeah.
And then I'm always looking for an incentive to get better data. So I mean, we do that on our own place. We need better data to make business decisions inside the area we're irrigating, and it's vital. But I have talked to people that their data, they don't feel there's an incentive for them to have good data on their own situation, and they're very afraid of what the state's going to do. And I go, more data you have on your own place, the better off you are. I still believe that. And it would have been nice to have that incentive built into the system so people could work with the department to explain maybe in some cases where the department doesn't have adequate data to look at some of the variations that exist or the anomalies. But anyway, when we go down the road and we enter the direct regulation language and stuff, where's the longer term data? Where does it come in from the department's standpoint or the individual irrigator standpoint?
So I think at the end of the day, the historic data, the long-term data really helps us understand the historic trends and the magnitude of decline. And so really the place it's going to be used is in understanding how much the system has been drawn down, right? So how those water levels have changed historically and what the overall magnitude of the change in that area is.
Is the magnitude data still considering the same length of time, 2016 to 23?
Magnitude is oldest record to newest record, as long as that newest record falls between 2016 and 2023. So if we had a well that we had measured this on from 1970 to 2020 to 2015, that didn't get evaluated for the magnitude. If that well had data from 1970 to 2016, it was evaluated. So that was a cutoff line. We had to have a data point that had occurred 2016 or newer.
So from a statistical standpoint, you run into issues in some sub areas because the number of wells with data is very limited. And others maybe better. So I struggle with that. We're kind of comparing one area to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Fred, you bring up a good point, and I wish, I'm not sure of a good way to incentivize data collection other than just asking and trying to market ourselves and the value of data. And I do agree with you. Data is what it is. It's neither good nor bad. It does help us understand the system. If we go out and expand our data collection and we start measuring new wells, you know, the first data from those wells are going to be 2024, even if the well is 50 years old. Over time, the trend of that well, we can compare it to adjacent wells, confirm it's in the same system, and then you can sort of back calculate for that particular well. But if it's in a completely new area and there's not much to compare it to, the new data are going to be valuable just in the short term. They wouldn't add much other than helping fill in and refine some of the contour maps if we redo those down the road. So.
Any other questions around the data? Or comments? Okay, thank you, Dark. So let's see if I can get us back over to where we need to be. Next. Okay. All right, can everybody online see the slides again? Yep. All right, thanks. So next we're going to talk about sub-area priority ranking. And I wanted to remind us all of the criteria we had discussed in the last RAC. We had proposed 4 criteria for determining how to prioritize or how to rank sub-areas by priority. And those 4 criteria are groundwater level decline rate. So how quickly is groundwater declining? Dark did the analysis for us here. We've got that data, and remember that data is for 2016 to 2023. That was the time period in which we evaluated the rate. So it's the most current data for rate. We want to look at total groundwater level decline magnitude, and so that is the oldest record to the newest record. We must have a record in 2016 or newer in order to have evaluated that. And again, you've got that in your handout there. And then 2 others we've talked about and had gotten feedback on were groundwater elevation below 40-80 feet above mean sea level. That is the historic Harney Lake bottom. And then a well-defined groundwater level cone of depression that dominates the area. And so we heard your feedback on that. And we primarily relied on 1 and 2. But 3 and 4 still informed decisions to some extent. So we then tried to bucket, if you will, the sub areas by priority and really putting them into what we're calling a high priority bucket, and that's based on this data analysis that Dark presented. And you can see what they are. They're up here in alphabetical order: Crane, Dog Mountain, Wallen, North Harney, Rock Creek, and Weaver Springs. And I think if you look at the decline magnitudes, the decline rates, you can very clearly see why those are in what we're calling a high priority bucket. And then the next bucket is we're calling it a lower priority bucket. It isn't that we don't still need to reduce our usage in these areas, but these areas don't have the rate of decline that is as severe as our high priority sub areas. And those are in alphabetical order, not in priority. Correct. So our prioritization right now has really been to prioritize them as high and as lower. And so that is what the data told us. And I guess at this point, what I'm really looking for are questions and feedback on 1, ranking things into buckets like that, and 2, what your thoughts are based on the data and analysis provided, as well as our sub-area construct as we've proposed. And obviously that would change if we were to change the sub-areas, because I assume this data analysis would change. Mark.
Don't want to repeat the whole conversation we had in the first hour and a half.
Yeah,
but that is relevant here.
Absolutely.
Is even the ones that aren't in the high priority are still contributing to the overall deficit in hydrological subbasin. So I still have an issue there. Well, going back to the magnitude one, because it was one of the two primary ones used. I'll go back to the conversation we had last month, is they're penalizing those that have the oldest priority. The one that has the largest period of record, which will probably manifest itself in the biggest magnitude. That opens up all kinds of interesting conversations on water law and having them ranked higher, because a higher ranking would probably cause what? Yeah.
It's gonna be a higher priority for focus on, reductions of use.
So possibly a higher priority or faster regulatory process to reduce water use. And that's gonna be conversions to the, maybe the most senior water right there, because they have the largest period of record, which can manifest itself into the largest magnitude.
Sure. I think one thing I would add to that is again, the timing component. And when we're talking about the water in the basin being thousands of years old, a period of record of 50 years is not like it, we're not, I'm kind of struggling with how to say it.
It's a drop in the bucket,
It's, yeah.
time scale wise.
Time scale wise,
Big
50 years is
challenge.
nothing compared to 8,000, right? Like,
So our actions here for regulatory process should be looking at a large scale, not what the most bang for the buck is, because it's easiest for the department. Sorry, I'm just using words that were.
yeah, no,
Like
so,
the department.
so should we be thinking about this on an 8,000 year time scale? Like, I guess what is the, like, I agree, we need to be thinking long term. But we also, I think, to Zach's question earlier, need to be pragmatic about getting to reductions quickly. Because when we have rate declines, and I'll point to like Weaver Springs, where the fastest declining measurement we have is 22 feet per year. You're talking about losing a lot of water level very quickly. Like, and so the sooner
Water
we
level and water volume, what's the difference in a longer period of time?
well, when you're talking about it taking thousands of years for the water to recharge the system, water level decline equates to serious impacts from groundwater level declines, right? Like that, I mean, that is the, at the end of the day, the challenge. The impacts that come with groundwater. So, that's my, that's one thing I think we're having to balance, right? Is the pragmatic, how do we slow these problems quickly, because they're really stacking up with how do we balance the long-term water budget for the basin? Absolutely. So I definitely hear you.
Zach has his hand up a little bit online, and we'll jump over here. Go ahead, Zach.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I like the coupling of magnitude declines with rates of decline, because that helps reduce the impact of period of record. The rates of decline only accounting for the recent 6 or 7 years. You know, that's agnostic to how long the well has been around. I mean, as long as it's been around for 6 or 7 years. So that's useful. I would add that I think maybe it could be worth looking at 3 possible buckets. I like the idea of bucketing these different sub areas by priority. That's a useful framework to give a shared understanding of where are we going to focus first for voluntary agreements or curtailment or other actions. I would suggest having a high, a medium, and a low bucket. So having 3 instead of 2 as currently proposed. And the reason for that is I was kind of looking for inspiration at what does Oregon already have that we can borrow from and don't have to reinvent. And what Oregon already has is the declined excessively conditions. You know, one declined excessively condition with respect to groundwater levels is 50 feet or more decline between the highest known water level and present day. The other condition is 3 feet or more per year. And they don't match perfectly to the analysis that Darek has presented, but they're useful kind of starting points for the discussion. And if you look at it through that lens, then you have 6 of the sub areas that meet at least one of those 2 conditions. And comparing my approach to the WRD proposed approach, Crane Buchanan would qualify as a high priority under what I think is a reasonable approach, because Crane Buchanan has a greater than 50-foot decline in at least one of its wells. But anyway, the benefit of having high, medium, and low could be that high priority are sub areas where wells are excessively declined. Medium priority could be sub areas where wells have not met excessive decline conditions, but are going and trending in that direction, that are likely to meet those excessively declined conditions in the near future. And low priority could be wells that are sub areas with wells that aren't close to meeting either the rate or the magnitude of excessively declined conditions. And I want to be clear, we're not really talking about excessive decline rules, to my understanding, in this rulemaking. It's simply an existing standard that we can borrow from. So I'm just thinking about it as useful from that perspective.
Great, it's helpful. Okay.
Thanks, Zach.
My question, I guess, in regards to this conversation, and I understand those that would be in a high priority area are very concerned because it's going to affect the most. A question that I have would be time frame. It's like, you're gonna address the high priority areas first and then to the lower areas. But what kind of time frame are we talking about? Are you gonna spend 6 months working on the high priority, getting things going? Are you gonna spend 2 years? And then how much longer before you get to the surrounding areas? Is it all gonna happen, you know, quickly, or is it gonna be 5 years or 10 years before you get to the low priority? If the timeline is faster, you could mitigate some of those wells that are right outside of the areas. If you're looking at a longer time frame, then people in the high priority areas are suffering, you know.
Can we
So
move
that
on to
would
the
be
next
my
question?
question.
That's the crux of the matter, right,
Yes.
Karen? And so I don't have an answer. I don't know, our commission met in Salem here 2 weeks ago. And I presented them with an hour of information, really to get to Karen's point. How much groundwater use reduction, by whatever means, how fast? That, at the end of the day, is the question. And I didn't present it to them because I need an answer today or tomorrow. I just wanted to get it in front of them so they can start considering it as we are all considering it here in this basin. You know, for this critical groundwater area here and future ones that will be designated elsewhere in the state. It really is the main issue. Rapid, significant reductions in groundwater use help the aquifer system. They help existing users. They stop domestic wells from going dry, but they come at a very significant cost to the folks who are taking up those losses in the groundwater use there. So we don't have an answer for that. I don't know. The commission directs a lot of what we do. And so it really is something I think to be discussed at future commission meetings, at future RAC meetings. But it should be in front of all of you a lot to give some consideration as to, at least from your perspective, what do you think is the correct approach or right answer to kind of balance the competing interests of stopping declines, maintaining aquifer levels, spring discharge, stopping wells from going dry, versus continuing to use water at some level to keep the economic engine going.
I will say that the next topic is going to get into some of that, and I think that will be. I think we're going to float some ideas and some, you know, things to consider around that, and I think we can have more discussion there, Karen. So if you can hold for a second, I think we will start to dive into some of that. But like Ivan said, I don't think any of us have an answer.
Jerry has his hand up online.
if I can get myself unmuted, sorry. Mark's point is, in terms of length of record, is understood and appreciated. As an example, the declines in Weaver Springs, are primarily since the mid 1990s, whereas the declines in the Crane area, are as early as the early 1970s. But when it's all said and done, you still have a significant decline that has occurred. It's just, it's been happening at a lower rate. But one of the problems we're bumping up against here in this discussion is the fact that we're having this discussion before the groundwater model is published. And I think there's going to be some things in that report, that relate to this discussion. It's unfortunate that it's not publicly available right now. And but I think, when it's all said and done, we still have to address these total declines and the ramifications of what that means.
Thanks, Jerry. So I guess we could also move on to the next topic, since it sounds like we really want to dig into the timing of things. What is the next step? And you can sit with the idea of rankings and what we've proposed and what this looks like. And hopefully have some feedback as we go through the rest of the presentation. Does that work for everybody? Seeing head nods, take that as a head nod. All right. So the next step is to talk about goals for curtailment. And really at the end of the day, what we're trying to talk about here is reduction of use. And so I want to bring us back to the opening goal for this entire process. Back in April, we talked about this, and at the end of the day, we're looking to reduce water use basin-wide through straightforward and transparent rules. That would be like, it's the epitome of a goal for us. Like, that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what we're trying to stay focused on here. So from a management perspective, as Mark called out, high priority subareas are going to be the focus for reducing use in the short term. It's voluntary reduction, regulatory curtailment. That's where we're going to focus. And then lower priority subareas are going to need some sort of thresholds for future action to incentivize reduction of use. So it's not that lower priority subareas don't have to bear any of the burden. It's that they're not the top priority for regulatory action going forward. And so I really want to highlight that if we can pair the two together, as Karen was talking about, we can have a focused impact on the areas of most severe decline, while also putting in place the structure to start reducing use in all sub areas across the basin and trying to balance that basin-wide budget. So as we think about curtailment, there's inputs we need in order to make effective decisions. And the first is something that Ivan coined a few weeks ago. He was preparing for the commission presentation. And really the first step is we need to establish a target water level trend, right? So what do we want water levels to do in a sub area in the basin as a whole? And once we've established that target, then we can move forward with the second input, which is permissible total withdrawal. So target water level trend is what are we trying to achieve? Permissible total withdrawal is what is the actual number that will get us there? And permissible total withdrawal, remember, PTW is the statutory term for how we implement curtailment in a critical groundwater area. So instead of curtailing, like taking it from a perspective of here's how much water use is happening and we need to reduce by this much, the statute set up the framework that we decide how much can be pumped and then assign that from most senior to most junior until you run out of water. And so it's two ways of looking at the exact same coin, or the two sides of the same coin. But the PTW is how do we get to our target? And then the last is what is our timing for achieving that PTW or implementing it, if you will. So how quickly do we get to that level of pumpage? Which then gives you a curtailment from actual use to PTW is the amount we're gonna have to curtail back. So those are the three inputs, and I want to dig more into each one. So the first input is target water level trend. And this is really the rate of change in the water level that we want to achieve with our effort here. And to help illustrate this, Ivan had put this graph together for the Water Resources Commission. I stole it because I think it's really helpful. And so here's a hypothetical hydrograph. It's got 4 different decline rates on it. In these cases, the groundwater level starts at 10 feet below ground surface at 2024, so it's fairly easy to see. The x-axis is time, and it goes from 2024 to 2044, so we're talking about 20 years here. And the y-axis is depth to water, and we go from 0 at the top to 120 at the bottom. And I want to also call out that water level trends are going to also be influenced by short and long-term climate, precipitation impacts, pumping changes, and changes in evapotranspiration. So all those things go into this, but at the end of the day, if we achieve a water level trend of no decline, we should see the water level existing within some sort of dynamically stable range. So based on climate, based on ET, based on changes in pumping for a season, we may see declines, we may see rises, but at the end of the day, the water level trend is fairly static and flat over the long term. And that's what that top line shows. The other lines are what half a foot per year looks like, what 1 foot per year looks like, and what 5 feet per year looks like. And when we think about the different sub areas that we've talked about and the data we've put together, the 5 feet per year is not a wild number. It is what we're experiencing in some places within the basin. And so over the course of 20 years, 5 foot per year comes out to 100 feet of additional decline. So the longer we take to implement reductions, the more, as Ivan has said, the groundwater level impacts continue to accumulate. So for target water level trend, our position at the department is really that we need to halt declines. So we need to see groundwater levels stabilize in some sort of dynamically stable range. The impacts of declines are listed here. And further declines, allowing further declines simply allows these impacts to continue to add up. And so as we see there, we're talking about dry wells, reduced spring flow, increased pumping costs, deterioration of water quality, land subsidence, and these are all problems with groundwater level declines. So first, before we move on from target water level trend, does anybody have questions about the concept or what I've presented here so far?
I'll dominate again. So during the groundwater study advisory committee about 3 to 4 years ago, when the first preliminary water budget came out, and it started showing that, 110,000 acre feet, that was the exact number of over appropriation compared to 135, 145,000 feet of use. It was asked specifically, are we trying to meet recharge as a goal? And there was conversation that probably wasn't realistic here, but when I look at that first bullet point, that's what you're trying to do. So if we're going to halt declines in this whole basin, you're going to shut off 110,000 acre feet of water. If you're going to align with the USGS study, and we're only pumping 135,000 acre feet to 140, so there's only going to be 30,000 to 35,000 acre feet of irrigation in the basin. Is that the department's goal?
That's our aspirational target, is the way I would phrase it, Marvel. And, I proposed it to the commission in a slightly different way. More, I think, from just the perspective of us as water managers, and I suspect you as folks who use water in the basin and live in the basin, driving around, looking at either sub basins or sub areas, how much water can we use out of this particular area and not have declines in our system? That seems like a valuable piece of data for all of us to have in front of us. Whether we actually get to groundwater use reductions that would equal a target decline rate of 0 feet or a flat line, or whatever the permissible total withdrawal calculation would be to reflect a target decline rate like that. That's the question. That's back to what Karen asked. How much, how fast? But it doesn't seem as helpful to me to talk about a decline rate of 3/4 of a foot per year or 2.3 feet per year. Those aren't really functional numbers that a lot of us are going to be able to understand and manage for easily. And long term, we have a statute that tells the department to determine and maintain reasonably stable groundwater levels in the state. And reasonably stable to us is something that's in this dynamic equilibrium where it's fluctuating seasonally, but not having a long-term downward trend. Now I'm going to back up a little bit, and the previous slide, if you want to pop back to it, this assumes that Mother Nature is delivering us a set amount of water each year, and that is not a good assumption. It also assumes that the natural consumptive use off the landscape is not changing. And that's a worse assumption we're finding out. And so the natural vegetation out there is consuming more water as time goes on because our growing season's longer and our temperatures are warmer. Even if precipitation and the projections for Oregon is that our precipitation is going to remain somewhat the same as what we see today, probably less snow and more rain over time. The actual consumptive use off of the landscape is going to increase. So for assuming our supply stays the same, we're going to have less usable water available for recharge to the aquifer systems, for runoff into the Sylvies, Silver Creek, Donner, and Blitzen. We're just heading in the wrong direction, and that's none of your fault. It's just Mother Nature. And so we have that superimposed on hypotheticals like this, but our first offer, I guess, for you folks to consider is that it seems reasonable to establish a target water level trend of 0 and figure out what the permissible total withdrawal is to achieve that. So at least we have that available for consideration for long-term management decisions as we try and reach a new equilibrium in the basin. Again, it doesn't necessarily end up being the target for future reductions in groundwater use. But I think it's a valuable data point to have. So happy to take questions.
Zach has his hand up. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot. I just wanted to add in, I think part of the difficulty in this conversation is translating the target water level trend, like the climate adjusted dynamic stability, to the PTW, like the permissive total withdrawal, which is like a volume per year. And that feels difficult to do. My understanding from the Groundwater Study Advisory Committee is that even in a hypothetical scenario where all water use is turned off tomorrow, November 30th, 2023, it could take years to see the impacts of that on the water level stability. I'm not sure if that's actually accurate or if I'm misremembering, but I guess just to put a fine point on it, there's two different ways that time matters. One way is the time lag between taking action and observing an impact. And the other way is what's the transition period look like between present day water use and ultimately achieving that PTW. And the first one we can't change because it's hydrogeologic. The second one we can change because that's a management decision. But I guess just to put a question to my overall comment or thought, Does anybody know when that USGS numerical model is coming out that can help us answer and understand the time lag from the hydrogeologic standpoint?
Embargo. If I could predict that, I'd probably be able to solve our problems here.
I did, talk to, Bill, the professor from OSU, you know, who's been working with Marshall Gannett on, coupling an economic model with the flow model, and they're working on a publication. It's too early for results to be shared, of course, until it goes through peer review. But there will be this analysis looking at the various economics of reductions in pumping that cost Andy money. But it'll also, reductions in pumping can relate also to reductions in new dry well complaints or pumping costs. I think you mentioned pumping costs turn out to be pretty small. But we will have a tool sometime in the future, you know, a year out, 18 months, 24 months, that can help provide some insights into some of these questions, getting back to the how much, how fast question there. So that's going to be there, and that will be helpful to add to the conversation. We just don't have it in front of us today. And frankly, I don't think it's something that we should be waiting on.
So Zach, I will say, I need Dark or Jerry to remind me, because it came in an email a while back, but I think Steve Gingrich is planning to present briefly on the model sometime in the spring, but it's not fully peer reviewed yet, and I'm not sure what that presentation is gonna include, and I think that's for the Washington Hydrogeology Symposium. So maybe we'll have like the edge cases in that presentation, and so we might have what happens if you shut off all pumping and what happens if you do nothing. But I can't say because Steve hasn't let us know.
Yeah, can I quickly follow up? I appreciate that. Thank you both for those responses. Is there a way, I agree that we can't wait for those products to be done before making decisions. That seems right to me. Is there a way that we can structure these rules so that they can be adaptively managed and incorporate that information when it comes out in the future?
We can certainly give that consideration, Zach. Good question.
Management instead of regulations, Zach, where are you going?
Jerry had his hand up. All right, Jerry.
So, yeah, it's correct that the USGS will be presenting at a symposium in the spring. As for the report, the main report itself, it's gotten through the supervisor review, and so it's on the the higher level of going, making its way to the publishers and the edits in the reviews that go along with those edits. So it passed some major hurdles. I mean, but the past experience with the publication part of it, it taught us that as they convert that report into a publication, there's a lot of things to catch along the way, and so that slows the process down. So, but the fact that it's right there on the doorstep of getting the publication editors involved, is getting us closer to that inline.
Thanks, Jerry. Ken.
To follow up a bit on what Zach had said, that we'll make these decisions without the information. We find ourselves in the position we're in because we're making decisions over the last number of years without the correct data. So why would we want to be doing that again? Because when the permits were issued when they shouldn't have been, because the department did not have correct information about what was down underground. And so now we're trying to, again, make some decisions going forward because we don't have the complete set of data.
I think we have the data in front of us that we need for the rules, unless I'm missing something. The coming up with, so the target water level trend, if we stick with that term and that concept, it is what it is. It's either zero or something greater than zero. And our approach would be, let's shoot for no further declines. And we should be able to calculate pretty accurately, because we have the study of groundwater use in the basin for a particular sub area or sub basin. These are the trends in water levels we see, and this is the amount of use. We should be able to calculate pretty accurately an estimate of the permissible total withdrawal to get us to a decline of zero, or of 1 foot per year, or 2 feet per year, whatever the number is. That isn't gonna, the economic model is not gonna shed any light on that. And the flow model really isn't gonna shed any light on that. I also went through my presentation before the commission meeting with the
GWAC.
Groundwater Advisory Committee on Tuesday of that week, and got some good feedback from them. And we were initially thinking we had 3 tools to come up with the permissible total withdrawal. And it really is 2. The third tool was the flow model, but the flow model is built on water level data and groundwater use data. And so it's not really an independent methodology or tool. Built into it are the first 2 pieces of data there that would go into establishing a permissible total withdrawal. So the rules themselves, mostly what we're talking about today are the boundaries of sub areas or sub basins. That should be in the rule. That probably will be helpful for us moving forward. The permissible total withdrawal has to be in the rules for the sub basins or the sub boundaries. But the scheduling of groundwater use reduction, whether it's done via voluntary agreements, enrollment in the CREP program, or curtailments through the critical groundwater area process, none of that is part of the rules that we're working on here today. So not having the model or the economic model associated with that and those results, I don't think is really slowing us down from the bulk of the work that's in front of us today.
Hey, Mark. What did the flow model have some relevance on the, lack of a better term, administrative subbasins? We talked about, you know,
if we had, well, I'll turn that over to Dark and Jerry. My understanding is that the USGS has only done a limited number of simulations with the flow model, and that's what's going to be part of their report. We're going to have to go find the resources to do more detailed simulations if we wanted to look at different what if scenarios in a sub-basin or a sub area. Dark, Jerry, any thoughts or insights on that?
Well, I'll just say that what we requested for the report was 2 extremes. One was, if you did not shut off pumping at all, what would be the worst case scenario under that situation? And then the other scenario was, if you shut everybody off, what would be the response to shutting everybody off, to show the other extreme, so that we could say, okay, those are the 2 curves that, you know, whatever we come up with is going to fall in between. We can't expect anything better than this, and we shouldn't expect anything much worse than this. But it's, you know, the model under those two situations, it will kind of show how much, you know, the pumping influences will spread to adjoining areas, and it will show, you know, just how recovery would look like as you start your curtailments. You know, getting into the specifics per sub area, yeah, that would take, you know, separate model runs to do that.
Is it fair to say, Jerry and Dark, that the model would help us with the timing conversation that we've had. So reductions in one sub area, what is the timing of those like, how long does it take for those changes to show up? And how far do those changes propagate in the system?
In general, the answer is yes. You know, in the groundwater report, you know, Steve talked about you know, specific areas and what the groundwater level trends are like. And you know, so the model one way or another hopefully will, as we look at the results, you know, we can look at you know, the recovery within those areas, either directly or indirectly, and get a feel for what's going to happen and the timing of that. You know, because again, with the different geologic materials, you know, how the system responds to the curtailment is, you know, in the upper Silver Creek area versus in the finer grain basin fill is going to look different.
Dark, looks like you got something to add in there.
Yeah, just on this, I just wanted to reemphasize that, you know, the model is built off of all of the data that we're already talking about considering for these different items. The same data that we use to delineate the sub areas, the same data that we're proposing we use to calculate the PTW. The model's based off of all that same data that we're already using for those processes. The strongest benefit for the model is that timing piece. So what is going to be the timing of any of these kinds of changes once that's implemented? And that's very difficult to do without the model. But all of those inputs we already have. The model's built off of the information we're using here already.
Agreed.
So last question then is, do we have an understanding of how long it takes to do a model run? Like, how much work is that? Just so that we all have an understanding. Say that again.
It's changing the pumping input file, and just you know, finding if you know, if it's a universal change in pumping rates, that's pretty easy. If we're doing it by sub area, that's going to take a little bit extra work.
And if we're matching with groundwater rights, that's an enormous amount of work, right? Because we'd have to change every well on every right that's in the model. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. If you get down to that level of detail, that's a lot of work.
Jerry, it would be simpler to, I'm just trying to think of some efficiencies. Talk about a 10 or 20 or 30 or 40% reduction in pumping generically for wells in a particular sub area. That would be something that would be more efficient to implement and simulate than applying that same 10, 20, 30, or 40% to a certain group of wells, like junior wells or wells that could be part of a voluntary agreement, things like that, because there'd be more detail involved. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. All you do is just multiply the pumping rates that you already have by that 20% reduction universally, as opposed to going in and tweaking well by well. That would be a lot of work.
Okay, thank you. I think that's helpful for us to understand. So, all right. So we've already started the conversation around PTW, the second piece of input, and talking about options to calculate PTW. We have two that we are considering, and we'll likely use both and compare them to each other. The first is the hydrograph approach, which involves plotting many wells from a single subarea together into a hydrograph, and then identifying the point at which water levels changed from tracking in some sort of dynamically stable range to consistent declines. And you know, the hydrograph we have flashed up here, I don't know, probably 100 times of Weaver Springs, you can see fairly stable water levels through the 80s. Sometime in the 90s, it starts to track off, and that becomes whatever the estimated pumpage is at that time is likely a good call for the PTW for that sub area. So that's the hydrograph approach, and that is a detailed look at wells in a sub area, and that's going to require that plotting of hydrographs and evaluating them well by well, sub area by sub area. The second option is a pumping rate and decline rate analysis, which is going to involve comparing current pumpage to the current rate of decline. And then we're going to have to assume some sort of correlation between pumping rate and decline rate to calculate the amount of pumpage that is going to achieve the target water level trend. So it's important to understand that correlation value between pumping rate and decline rate is going to be estimated based on our best scientific knowledge of the subareas and the subsurface materials. And thus, you can get to if we reduce the pumping rate by this amount, we should see this sort of change in the water level trend. And we could then implement curtailment that way. And so comparing the two approaches, we can hopefully get to the most accurate method for setting PTW. The last thing was a note. We've already talked about the limitations of the model, and so I'm not going to go into that any further. The last comment I have is we really want to make sure that the PTW is defensible, and that it's based in science, and that it uses the 6 years of study data that we have and the decades of groundwater level monitoring that has been done by the department, by permit condition water level measurers, and to make sure that analysis is robust. And so that's establishing a PTW is going to be a lot of work for Jerry and Dark. Although Jerry's retiring, so probably a lot on Dark. But that's what we're trying to get to. And that's, again, the number that you're all looking for what we need to, how much we need to reduce use. What is that, as Ivan said, that aspirational goal what we get to. So any questions on the PTW piece? All right, so the final input is timing for implementing the PTW. So as we talk about timing, I want us to keep a few points in mind. The first is, if the PTW is set to a value that is intended to achieve the target water level trend, then any pumping value greater than the PTW results in further declines within the subarea, right? So not getting to the PTW quickly accrues additional declines, and we've already talked about that. And then essentially another way of saying that is implementing a phased approach results in accepting a lower groundwater level elevation in each subarea, because these subareas all are experiencing declines, and the longer it takes to get to that number, that PTW number, the more declines we're going to accrue. And then
John Short, I think a question on that.
yeah, let me get to this last point, and then I'll go to John.
Okay.
So the last point is that the groundwater system is complex, and thus response to reductions in use are going to be complex. And we've tried to minimize that complexity with subareas and grouping wells together that track together and that will likely have timely and efficient responses together, but it will still be complex. There's no way around that. So, John, I see you've got your hand up.
Thank you. I understand the model's not available and that kind of thing, but it sounded like the two edge conditions have been tested and are going up the flagpole or whatever. My question is, for us to decide some of these things, if all pumping was shut off, how long did it take for the basin to stabilize or to get to a zero rate of decline, that number must have been leaked out to one of you guys, right?
Due to our relationship with USGS, I can't tell you what that number is.
Unless you got $40.
Mark?
I got it, coming out.
I told you we were supposed to hold out for 100. No, I mean, I would love to be able to use that number, but it hasn't been peer reviewed, and so if there is a change that comes out of the peer review, and we are talking about something that isn't accurate, it's not what we want to do. And we also have a relationship with the USGS we have to maintain.
So if that number is 100 years, doesn't that kind of impact what we're deciding right now?
That's a really great question. We can think about it from that perspective. If it takes 20 years for the responses, like if we shut off all pumping and it takes 20 years for everything to recover, that's one scenario. If it takes 50 years to recover, that's another scenario. If it takes 100 years to recover, that's another scenario. How does that impact our decision making?
There won't be ever any county in 100 years. We wait that long, we should do everything off and wait to recover.
Right. Absolutely.
Even if we wait 20 years, there won't be ever any county.
So can you put that into perspective? Can you phrase that differently so that it, when you say that, what do you mean in terms of how we implement the timing of this? And maybe I'll hold there and let's go to the next slide really quick and let's talk about timing and what it looks like on a hypothetical hydrograph and what that means for future declines. If we can go there. And then I'll come back to you, Karen, because I really want to get into that because I think that is the crux of what we're trying to ask here. So the purpose of this graph that I'm showing is to drive conversation and help illustrate the ramifications of different timelines by presenting an idealized scenario for the timing of implementing the full PTW. So the graph uses the current average decline rate for Weaver Springs, which is 5.9 feet per year. And that's in the data analysis dark. The x-axis is time, and it starts with 2025 and it goes through 2035. So that's 10 years of time. The y-axis is the depth to water, and it starts at 0 at the top and goes down to -70 feet on the bottom. So the dark blue is no curtailment, and we end up with a final water level that's about 65 feet below current levels. So if we did nothing based on the average rate, that's where we end up. Obviously, based on the spread of data and the rates of data, some of those wells, the worst is declining at 22 feet per year. Others are declining at less than 5 feet per year. So this is an average, but again, it's an idealized scenario. So we're thinking about no action equals 65 feet of further decline in this area. The brown line equals a 10% reduction in use per year. And provided that it's a 1-to-1 correlation between decrease in rate of pumping and decrease in rate of decline, we end up with over 10 years stabilizing at about 26 feet of further declines. So if we implement it 10% per year and everything goes perfectly and there's immediate response, we're talking about another 26 feet of decline. The green line is another 5%, is a 5% reduction in use per year, with a final water level of about 56 feet below current levels, but that takes 20 years, which isn't projected on this graph, right? That green line is still on its way down. But over the course of 20 years, we end up at 56 feet of further decline, which is only 9 feet away from no action. And then the light blue line is full implementation of the PTW after, say, a 5-year delay. So maybe we say you've got 5 years to transition, and then we're gonna fully implement the curtailment. And with that, we end up with a final water level that's about 30 feet below current levels. And it takes 5 years to get to that. And that's if implementing the PTW results in immediate falls.
I think your interpretation of the data is false lead. You're taking an average of 5.9% a year, but your subset of the wells are mostly in Weaver Springs that show the biggest decline. You look at your average subset of decline here. I mean, you're 1.2. So you take 1.2 for 10, you're not at 65 feet below.
This is just Weaver Springs.
But this is just Weaver
Okay.
Springs.
I'll stop where we're at. But even look at Weaver Springs, so you say 10% a year for 10 years.
100%.
Yeah.
That's a 10% reduction to get to the PTW. So the PTW would be some level of pumping.
Tough question to ask when we don't know what PTW is. We don't know the cause factor of what a decision or agreement would be here. We don't know if PTW is 30%. We don't know if PTW is 90%.
Right.
So it's a tough question for us to grapple with unless we know PTW. It's also, I've heard it said once or twice today, it's gonna hurt, the producer, hurt the user, it's gonna hurt the community. Declining groundwater levels are hurting domestic well, and we have to read that, lowering property level. But the tax base of this county is a lot on irrigation. And unless we know actually what that implication is, it's an unfair question to ask. And I know I've said that for the last 3 meetings, but I still like it.
But don't you already have that answer? Because he just said that the problem started back in the 90s. With too many pivots. So how can you say that? How can you say you don't have the data to figure out how to fix it?
So the level of decline in Weaver Springs started in the 90s. So if we go back to the amount of irrigation that's in the 90s, hypothetically, the level of decline would go back to where it was.
Yeah, well, probably in the same amount of years.
I don't know the same amount of years, but I would agree with you, Ben, that yeah, back in the 90s, whatever pumping level was there wasn't showing rate of decline.
I know it wasn't because me and Eckley would have all kinds of discussions on it. And my well is fine.
But Mark, I think what I'm hearing you say is, these are hypothetical, so there's no real numbers tied to them. There's not an actual, what are we currently pumping? And what's the PTW? And over 10 years, at 10%, actually, we're talking 5,000 acre feet or 50,000 acre, well, it's less than that in Weaver Springs. Is it 5 or 25,000? And then you can start to assess economic impacts for the community when you talk about that many acres going.
And I thought when we started this journey, 2015, 2016, that we were gonna work towards what a community's goal would be as far as what a new where that would be. Maybe we're still gonna get there, but the first bullet point on this PowerPoint told me down.
Okay.
Give it.
I'm just following up on Mark too. I felt the same way when you're telling us that no decline, which like Mark said since the beginning, because I've been sitting here since the beginning with Mark, is that we understand I can't say we, because I don't know who else understands it, as a basin that unless we shut every irrigation well off, we're gonna have declines. That's pretty much what our reality is. So we're looking at what can we live with, what is reasonable, because we're gonna have declines or we're gonna lose Harney County because we don't have economy. So what are we gonna do? So the happy medium is we're sitting here trying to figure out not how do we get to zero, because I don't think that's not where my head's at. We're not gonna get to zero decline unless we all just move. I mean, because we can't live here if we can't have you know what I mean? So I'm just trying to say that I guess I'm sitting here, it's hard for me to hear zero decline because that's not what we're striving for. We're trying to find out what can we live with and still keep our community viable. So, yeah. say other than that.
What would be the effective way to have that conversation as a part of this? You know, maybe, you know, simultaneously to the development, you know, identifying the data, which we're still, you know, there's still work to be done. But what it's telling us is that some change is coming. We can assume that much. Therefore, having proactive conversations now to prepare to keep the economy viable and the community whole, you know, what would that process look like to help land there kind of maybe together?
Bill Jager's economic study.
Well, they go, oh,
What was that?
Jager's economic study with a numerical model that USG is putting in. Would help us, we don't have that ability.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't have a lot of confidence in that. There's a lot of unknowns in terms of process, Mark, but, I believe that this is going to look different from one sub area to another. When you have a decline in Weaver Springs down to a certain level, it's gonna look different by a lot than a decline in Windy Point or Radisson. So this is going to need a time process. Because we don't really know what, if you took a 10%, we really don't know what that's gonna be. We really don't. I mean, I think the projections for conversation and analysis of the level of monitoring that you need, but that comes back to that, you've heard me say it, that we're going to have some kind of process where whatever decision's made, then you can guess and project, but it's going to need to be monitored over time. As a small area, because each area, as you outlined, 15 sub areas are going to all act a little different, some more than others. And then I come back to throw a caveat in it that comes back to the individual irrigator. You know, you hit an area and you have an irrigator that has no decline and he's at the edge or in another area. I worry about that because there are very specific small aquifers that are pretty much independent as best I can tell. But so it gets complex, and then you add the doctrine of prior appropriation, senior versus junior, and that comes in play. That's real important here. So I try not to walk back to that level here because we're not really talking about it, but I want to remind everybody that it comes into play because we are projecting. We're projecting in good faith, but our accuracy probably won't be really good. So I'm hoping we have, you know, benchmarks over time, and then the community needs can come into play here over time. They need to be right up front. This water in Hardin County is crucial. And we're still guessing in some areas.
but you can't suck blood from turnip.
I don't disagree with that. There's a lot of avenues we haven't explored in terms on the positive ledger. I'm not gonna go there here, but everything from watershed management to artificial recharge, those sorts of things. That's on the positive side. We're spending a lot of time on the negative side, rightfully so, because we have serious problems in a number of areas. And not all areas have a decline. Some have a slight. I think you data shows. Anyway, hopefully I didn't confuse everybody, but we are guessing. And we need to be adaptive flexible in this process at the rulemaking level and at the community level to give us room to maneuver a little bit as we go down this time frame.
Well, good point. Yeah, Tim.
Jerry has his hand up, and then Zach has his hand up.
Okay. Jerry, then Zach.
So, two points related to the zero decline rate. One is, if we achieve a zero decline rate, I would anticipate that would result in a groundwater level that's below, the historical levels. So, within those cone of depressions, the center of the cone may recover a bit, while the peripheries of that cone continue down until they stabilize. And but the net level is going to be at a lower level. Now, in regards to the amount of pumping that's going to have to be cut back to achieve that zero decline rate, part of the pumping is capturing groundwater discharge, and that's going to that amount of capture is still increasing with time. And then, so the question is how much of that capture is occurring, and that would may result in the fact that you don't have to have 100% of shutoff to achieve that zero decline, but it does come at an expense. It comes at an expense of of groundwater discharge that has historically happened, and then that begs the question: is that tolerable?
Zach.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to follow up on that, which is, I think no doubt we could benefit from having more information for this conversation, but we don't have that information. And something's got to change. We've been talking about these groundwater declines for, since 2015. And we know that there's particular parts of this basin, specific sub areas that have been seeing extreme declines in the groundwater levels. So I don't know. I'm curious from a process standpoint, does this committee have to decide and agree upon all of these different pieces of the puzzle, the ultimate total goal, the ultimate PTW, or can this rulemaking committee find starting points, and those starting points can then be informed by future inputs of data like the economic model, like the numerical model? Would that be a reasonable place to start, or is it the charge of this committee to decide upon all of these pieces of the puzzle, and we have to do that?
So I guess it's kind of to Fred's point a little bit, rephrasing. Do we have to have all the data before we can start that conversation, or can we start with what we have now and build?
So I don't think we'll ever have all the data, and we will never have all the answers. And we have to find the starting point and move forward. And we have to realize that we have to be adaptive and flexible. And by no means is the conversation over or finished or final. And this is not easy, anybody. And this is not like, this is where the rubber meets the road with our rulemaking process. This is where it gets really hard. And I agree with Mark that maybe it is an unfair question to ask about timing without understanding the cost that's implied. And so the next step is to calculate those PTWs. Right now, that would be based on our current sub areas and our current rankings, and we would get to a number for each sub area. And then we would be able to see what is our estimated groundwater use from 2018 and compare that to what is our PTW. And then we will know what the cost is in acre feet, which I think you can then extrapolate onto acres. And hopefully those of you who do business in this valley using groundwater can tell us from an irrigated ag perspective what that cost is. And I think that's really the next step in this process, and this is where it gets challenging. And
yeah, I guess kind of saying it a different way, this is a very complicated and lengthy rules process. Departments embarked on a couple of those at the same time with the groundwater allocation work that's going on. But writing rules and changing rules is a straightforward process. Agencies do it all the time. We're getting better and faster at it. We don't have to check all the boxes with this process this time around. But we need to make significant progress. And the community has to recognize that in some sub areas or some sub basins, significant amounts of groundwater reduction are going to need to occur through some mechanism. How fast we get there is really the question. The rules aren't going to deal with the how fast part. That's going to come through voluntary agreements, whatever details are in the voluntary agreement. The CREP program, groundwater reductions will occur within 3 to 4 years probably, and then they will stop on those acres that are enrolled. Those things will dry. And then the curtailment process through the contested case hearing process, that's sort of where the scheduling and scoping of how much reduction and on what schedule would go through that contested case process, weather that storm and see where it comes out at the other end. But that process is not part of the rules process. Really, the main thing is boundaries, sub-basin boundaries or sub-area boundaries. We should get those into the rules so we know what we're dealing with geographically, and groups of water users can start forming and talking. And then this concept of permissible total withdrawal, those initial calculations or estimates, however you want to characterize it, need to get into the rules. They can be changed. It's just open up the rules, change them down the road, close the rules again and move forward. So we do have ways to be adaptive, but we want to get as far down the pathway with this process as we can for any number of different reasons. Your time is valuable, our time is valuable, and we need to start managing the system that we've got as quickly as we can. So.
A quick follow-up, Ivan, that's really helpful context, and I don't know that that's a shared understanding. That certainly wasn't my understanding. I thought that the RAC would have to try to wrestle with the rate of change leading to eventual PTW. That's sort of what I thought this slide was about here. But you're saying that the committee's goal is to identify sub areas. The committee's goal is to identify the total PTW, but not necessarily the time to achieve the PTW. Can you reiterate that if I got that wrong?
Yeah, Zach, and sorry, I guess it wasn't complete. To get to the PTW, we have to have, unless somebody has a better approach, we have to have a target water level trend. So the guys can then figure out how much groundwater pumping can continue on to achieve that trend over time. So we do need the target water level trend, which gets us to the PTW. The target water level trend isn't necessarily part of the rules explicitly, but it's built into that PTW calculation. Darek and Jerry have, I believe, started working on PTWs for each of the 15 sub areas that we've proposed. If we consolidate sub areas into sub basins, those can just be added up unless I'm missing something. And, you know, we'd still have those numbers available to us at that point in time. So does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yes.
Seems like a dirty shot at this point, but I kind of need to know how seriously the WRD takes the state law that says that you have to maintain stability in these basins. Because I don't know how you can have any conclusion other than zero decline, given the historical data that we have. I don't know how you can come to any other conclusion other than zero decline if you take the law seriously. And if you don't, what does that open up? Because that seems to me like a sideboard that your department has as a state agency. So would you address that a little bit? Because it seems to me like our job is to try to decide how we can help get there in the least painful way possible. But if that's not our goal, then if you're telling me that's not the sideboards, then a whole bunch of other things become possible. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think that's what we laid out today, is that the statute requires the agency to determine and maintain reasonably stable groundwater
What
levels.
does that mean to the department? Reasonably
That
stable?
means no decline, which
Okay.
is back to the bullet point that
Okay.
Mark takes
Thanks
issue
for
with.
saying that.
Yeah, but again, how we get there is not mapped out, and the department doesn't have a position on that. We've talked about the benefits of getting there very quickly. You know, it's useful to talk about extremes. We slammed the brakes on in 5 years, and the entire basins at the PTW, that would be akin to 110,000 acre foot reduction in pumping and would have those ramifications. Or there's a longer term approach to getting there, or it's a more targeted approach through a sub area where that's where the focus is at to get under control more quickly the areas where the decline rates are really bad. That's where, like I said earlier, my eyes as a hydrogeologist go to these big cones of depression with decline rates in excess of 10 feet per year. That's a problem. I don't think anybody around this table can say that that's not a problem. Fixing it is gonna hurt, and that's what the timeline is about there. So. Yes.
And the rest of us speak.
Yeah, please.
About say 4 years ago, we went into this LISA program, you've heard of it. Where traditionally the sprinklers are 90 inches. And in the LISA program, they're 45 inches. For smaller sprinklers. And a lot of you people have them, but they, anyway. We was using, before that, we was using 1,000 gallons a minute. We went back to about 650 gallons a minute. So if you think saving 350 gallons a minute in a 24-hour period, it's a pretty good saving. And I haven't noticed any difference in the crops. We have, but if everybody did that throughout the basin, it would probably solve a lot of your problems. And it would be a painless, it costs a little bit. I think we had to pay $8,000 to have Jay come out and do that, but when we got it done, Harney Electric paid, I don't know, $3,500 as a benefit of their electric, Harney Electric. So anyway, it's a pretty painless way to go, and you guys have the control of water rights and permits and that kind of stuff. You could, because I see people around me all over the county that are not, they're just still pumping full bore, so that's one way. If I was the boss, I'd just
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, and you're kind of alluding to maybe where some of these conversations are going about, pivoting to that discussion about how the community adapts. Through changes in practice, through land use changes, through voluntary agreements, through the crap, there's these things out there that I think that's a part of this conversation. Maybe we've been waiting for the data, maybe we can just go ahead and get started, or we need a little bit more, but I think what you're bringing up is kind of getting to that key point where that's a discussion that's probably looming now for everybody to start to wrap everyone's heads around what changes.
Well, it is going on, it is changing. A lot of people are automatically reducing their use, due to a number of practices like he brings up, so. And I want to remind everybody, we've had a lot of conversations on it, you need to be, rewarded, it's the wrong word, but.
Incentivized.
Well, that too, but I was thinking, when these changes of conservation have been going on, you need to get credit for them as you go forward. So day zero isn't today, when you've been doing those kind of practices for 5 years, so that comes into play here too, and it does get into the rule a little bit on how you implement.
Well, and I think that feeds into the voluntary agreement discussion, though. Within a sub-basin, voluntary agreement could include having modifications to irrigation, and, those are places where that would drill down into specific areas and having agreements, because that would automatically reduce within that sub-basin a certain amount of usage. And so that's, I think we're all itching to see what a voluntary agreement could actually look like on the ground in a sub-basin, because that's where the rubber meets the road of how much reduction you can actually get to without going to priority dates. But the thing I want to make sure, and I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but we do not forget the impact to our utilities. If irrigation gets shut off in this county, none of us will be able to afford the power. There won't be a homeowner left in this county that can afford their power bill if all irrigation shuts off. Our irrigation subsidizes our utilities, and that impact, we don't even have the ability to wrap our head around currently.
There's a lot of maintenance costs, annual costs associated with delivering power in these kind of areas too, and.
But irrigation, I've had the utilities tell me irrigation subsidizes it for all the domestic use.
My comment was holding that point real important.
I'm gonna skip that. All right, so this is a great, honestly, this is a good discussion. It's a needed discussion. It's a hard one, but it's where this needs to ultimately go, right? And so I think we can probably wrap this up where we're at. I think it would be beneficial to know, looking forward in our future meetings, there's certainly agenda items that have been programmed out to keep this moving forward. But I also want to know what you all want to see on the future agendas. And particularly on this component that we're talking about right now, and the community, and some of the ways that community education could help, prepare for some of these changes and make some of these changes. Or on other things, we talked about transfers earlier. I think there's probably a lot of questions about that, and it warrants a discussion on its own. Are there other items that you want to see on future agendas that need to be addressed and aren't being? You don't have to tell me right now.
Well, the transfers, is that something that comes before what this committee or RAC or whatever is transferred within the sub-basin?
We're not gonna be able to I'd say this, unfortunately, we're not gonna be able to write like basin-specific transfer rules in the Division 512 rule process that are gonna help us or clarify things for us. Those have got to be dealt with in the transfer rules, Division 380, which we're slowly gearing up towards updating those rules. They need a significant workover for a number of reasons. A couple of us were just talking at lunch today, you know, there may be an opportunity to create a new section within those rules that deal with transfers within critical groundwater areas and address things like sub-basin approaches or sub-area approaches, things like that, to help us with that. What we're trying to work towards is maximum flexibility, but not force us to issue transfers that are not in the best interest of the water users or injure other users. We've got loopholes in our current system that need to be closed, basically. But I guess short answer is we're not going to be writing like transfer related rules into this rule process.
And also those transfers are statutory, like the backbone for the transfer rules is statutory.
Yeah.
It specifically states what can happen with the transfer, and they don't leave us any sort of wiggle room from what I can see related to critical groundwater areas. So it doesn't say these transfer statutes go away when you're in a critical area. We have to abide by that. Other topics?
Yeah, just anything else, you know, we can just kind of spitball it and then we'll capture it and then we can wrap our head around it and see what we might be able to put, you know, to address it in the future. But you know, other than the process of this rulemaking, you know, there are other items that need to maybe be interjected into these conversations that we're missing.
Based on the discussions today, are there other pieces of data? You know, Darek and Tim presented a lot of stuff. Do you want to revisit any of that at the next RAC meeting, or do you want supplemental information sent to you, you know, between now and then that would help with anything? Any questions you have?
We'll be circling back on sub areas. I mean, we got a lot of good feedback on that, so I think there's going to be, again, a couple months before the next meeting, so it'll be certainly an opportunity to crunch
Christmas
that.
is in there too, you know.
Sounds
like Brian canceled their Christmas.
That's right.
So Chris Hall, we'll do public comment, and we'll come back after that, just to make sure there is anything else anyone wants to share. You have public comment as well? Okay, so we'll start with Chris Hall, then we have one more in the room. You know, just the basic rules for public comment. This is an opportunity for the public to share their comments. You know, we please try not, you know, to keep it within a few minutes. This is not, you know, the RAC has had their opportunity, so not intended for, you know, the RAC necessarily to respond to these comments, but to listen to the feedback that the public has, and those can be considered as we move forward. So we'll go with Chris, and then we'll go to the one in the room, and then if anybody else online that I missed also has a comment, just do the virtual hand raise, and we'll get to you after that. So, Chris, go right ahead.
Great, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Christopher Hall, Executive Director of Water League, and I thank you very much for this opportunity to address you here today. Before I jump into my comments, I just want to note really what an existential threat it is to run out of water. And I can see it, it's palpable in this room. It'll only get more heated and concerned as this process moves forward. And what I see here is a front row seat to really what's going on throughout the West. And it's a real serious issue. And I think the way these folks here are handling it is exemplary. And I think that at the end of this process, hopefully the rest of the West can learn from what Harney County is doing. And I really salute you. I'm going to return to some thoughts I've had in the previous RAC meetings because it seems like it came up a little bit here today. And it's if the Water Resources Department position is to halt water level declines, which is strongly inferred by statute, then the entire Harney County critical groundwater area must be potentially subject to corrective control orders at any time in the future once a contested case hearing under ORS 537.742 has been completed and the Water Resource Commission has issued its final order and any Oregon Court of Appeals complaints have also been resolved. The Oregon Water Resources Department has identified high priority subareas and low priority subareas for the potential imposition of corrective control orders in the future. The entire critical groundwater area consisting of all the subareas should be included in one contested case hearing to capture all the potential corrective control orders that could be issued at any time in the future based on permissible total withdrawal triggers set in the contested case hearing. These triggers would be actualized when permissible total withdrawals have been exceeded in each subarea so that at any time in the future, any well in the entire Harney County critical groundwater area can be curtailed, regardless of whether it's in a high or a low priority subarea. Now, the reason why for this is that we know that the designation of a critical groundwater area and the imposition of corrective control order process can take 5 to 10 years, depending on the resistance to it. However, the idea that a new rulemaking process would have to be started up every time a new subarea exceeded the permissible total withdrawals, it's unreasonable. The curtailment of water of any well in the Harney County critical groundwater area must be a ministerial action by the OWRD staff once a critical groundwater area wide contested case hearing has run its full course and all due diligence has been completed. The subareas should only be used for purposes of understanding hydrology in a finer grain detail to inform exceedances of permissible total withdrawals. I asked the OWRD staff to directly address how future water curtailments will occur in low priority subareas in order to remove the ambiguity about how cumbersome the process could be going forward as regards the future need to curtail water in the low priority areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Okay, we have one comment back here. Just go ahead and state your name.
Yeah, Ken Barely, I've been playing with Harney County for a while. My only comment was that I think rather than the legal analysis you just heard and the scientific analysis that the department has provided, I think it would be very helpful to have kind of what's the range of public policy decisions that the community has available to them. Because right now, the notion is that it's confined by only the science and only the law. And I think there are other elements about how do you maintain a community who's dependent upon water for their livelihood can survive at few times. So and that element has not been on the agenda to my knowledge in a clear way. And trying to figure out how to put that on there, I think would be useful.
Very good, thank you.
You're about hard work, Eddie.
Okay, I guess before we close out, do you have another something?
John Short has his hand raised.
What's that?
John Short has his hand raised.
Looks like one more person has his hand.
Okay, yeah, John, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, my comment would be that, and maybe I've missed something here, but it sure seems like the numbers add up to not much, if any, water for irrigation long term. And so, boy, how can there be an incentive for agriculture to be efficient and do the conservation measures if in reality they're going to be regulated off in 10 years? I get at my clients ask me that, well, you know, what they should be doing, and it's like, well, it's not clear from the numbers that we've seen today that I see an answer, and it's just I'm hard pressed to see why farmers would invest in their systems to make them more efficient if there's no real future for them. That's all.
Thank you, John. Good question. I think it's
Little
something
slower. They'll get hungry.
we're gonna get into, you're moving forward, you know, these are tough questions and things that we need to face. Again, I kind of want to bring up again, just checking in with the group. You know, what's missing? What do we need to make sure to be addressing and discussing? I think, you know, John's maybe kind of bluntly telling us what it is that we need some conversation around. Anybody else thought where the conversation needs to go moving forward? Brendan?
I don't know that it's helpful, but I don't exactly know how this rules committee intersects with the 7 years of community-based water planning that has a groundwater plan developed and provisionally approved by water commission. But
Yeah, I think that is a great question. There's been a lot of work, you know, in the conversations I've had with some of you already, you know, there's been a lot of work that's happened over the years for a long time, on this topic, and particularly on the, you know, the education component on what you know, opportunities that are out there to make adjustments, to less water. And we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We want to be able to utilize a lot of the hard work that's already occurred, but not everybody was there. So finding that, you know, that intersection where we can capitalize on the work that's already been done. Andy?
I have one question. I just want to make sure I understand. So the department, their position is if they can regulate some of their sub areas, they think that's gonna make a difference with curtailing the balance, correct? That's kind of what I got out of it today.
Andy, I don't know if I'm following.
So if you curtail this, if you take 4 or 5 of these sub areas and you curtail the water in them, then you think you're gonna fix it?
At a broader basin scale?
Right.
No. Again, I'll go back to, I guess, kind of one of my general statements. The approach that we've been working from, and it's based on the agency's history and being more reactive than proactive, is we're focusing a lot of our attention on the areas where the decline totals, the magnitude of the decline is significant, and where the rate of decline is high. And we want to get that slowed down as quickly as we can so that that doesn't get worse, because with those rates, we've tried to kind of get people thinking about that, and I tried to get our commitment thinking about that. Time really matters. At 10 feet per year in 10 years, and we've been at this for 8 since 2015, we're gonna lose another 100 feet ahead. Weaver Springs is below 100 feet, we'll be at 200 feet. On its way down. These things don't self-correct. We have to fix it, or we have to absorb the costs of those continued declines. And so our focus has been on the 4, 5, 6 sub areas that have the cones of depression and the fast rates of decline. We really haven't considered the broader basin and the broader water budget question. What should be done there? It's a lower priority for us, I guess, is the way that I would look at it. We'll have more time because the damage being done there, the decline rate isn't as bad. And so those cumulative totals over the next 5 or 10 years, I guess, are acceptable to us. That's not a great word, but we've only got so much capacity to handle it. If you guys think a better approach is taking a look at the basin as a whole, the whole critical groundwater area, kind of what Chris Hall was getting at. We can look at options to do that. You know, and see what that would look like. But it's either gonna be, the one thing that I would say, and I'll look to Jerry and Dark here for confirmation. I'm gonna use rough numbers. I forget what the data are. Weaver Springs' current use is something like 25,000 acre feet a year. A 10,000 acre foot reduction in Weaver Springs is going to show a positive change in water level declines. We'll see those start to flatten out. If we take the Silver Creek Basin and spread 10,000 acre feet of reduction across the Silver Creek Basin, we aren't going to see anything. We'll know that there's a reduction in use, and we'll know that we're heading in the right direction. But the results of that aren't going to be obvious for some time. And so that's just something else for all of us to kind of consider along those lines. So, Jerry, Dark, any thoughts on that? Or are we losing?
Jerry, there.
I'm here. I don't really have much to add to that.
So, you know, again, the department's been focused on the areas with big declines and fast declining groundwater levels. We can pivot and take a look at the subbasin approach and see what that would look like. We can present PTWs for these 15 sub areas and sum those up for the subbasins. And compare and contrast those to the current water use estimates within those same areas there. But we're sort of faced with the same issue. We got to start reducing water use through some means, and there's lots of alternatives: LISA systems, the voluntary reductions, CREP, curtailment through the contested case process. And then the big question is how fast, when we start, and how fast do we progress down that path? So, does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I just go back to, if it's all coming out of the same bathtub and you turn this side off and this side off, you know, it looks to me like you have to turn the whole thing off if you want to stop the reduction.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, it's like you're picking pieces and parts, you know, and you think you're gonna change the static water level. To me, that's, I don't know, I get it.
Well, and Andy, and really, a couple of the folks at Groundwater Advisory Committee, when I gave my quick presentation to them a couple of weeks ago, you know, they said, well, hey, I mean, you're talking about the target water level trends at best being zero. What about recovery? What about increasing groundwater levels? I don't personally feel, and the model results will help us with that, I hope. I'm not sure that's even realistic in an arid environment like this where recharge is just not much and getting less with climate change. So we're talking about putting the brakes on to stop water levels from declining. And something like these cones of depression in Weaver Springs will slowly fill in, but they're filling in by robbing and that cone spreading further. So we'll continue to drop groundwater levels for a long time, probably further out into the system around that hole. But we're not talking about things ever getting better from a water level perspective. We're really trying to minimize damage to domestic wells, groundwater discharge to spring complexes. In this basin, we don't have a tremendous amount of the surface water groundwater connection like we do in the Deschutes Basin and the Klamath Basin. They're different, you know, they'll have different management issues and challenges there, but trying to put the brakes on and stopping the problem from getting worse is going to benefit the community too. You know, that's one of the counterbalances there.
Right. Yeah, the interrelationship between these scrub areas and these scrub basins is very variable. That some of them are very independent of the others. You could do whatever you want in a Donner Blitzen, and it will not move water through the big clay blob. The sticky clay in the Meyer Lake. That water stopped and it goes east. So that's an extreme example where you could shut the Donner Blitzen off, it wouldn't make any difference on the north side of the lake. Other sub areas and sub basins also have big clay barriers, sediment fill, as the department called, that limit movement of water back to another area or a problem area. So it sounds like there's disagreement, but I think the department recognizing the differences in these areas is important. How we deal with that probably is a question, but you can do whatever you want south of Meyer Lake, it ain't gonna affect the north of Meyer Lake, which is the bottom line. I mean, all the water is connected hydroscopically. Huh?
Hydrologic.
It's actually hydroscopically when you look at the connection of, correct me if I'm wrong, but anyway.
I'm not doing this.
So we.
This is still under 5 12.
All right, I think we're reaching our pumpkin hour, but I think the point is well taken, and some of the feedback we got today, we'll look to see if there are other ways that he's recognizing that water isn't not one big bathtub, but maybe there's other ways to chop this up. So I think, yeah.
One more question. Brianna, do you want to talk about your dinner tomorrow night?
So I'm having a dinner at the Historic Central Hotel. And Ivan and Kelly and Graham Thomas are gonna come and talk just about Division 512 and the prep program, and they'll take questions and answers afterwards. Dinner's provided, so it starts at 6.
Free dinner.
Free dinner.
Nice.
That's right.
Good deal.
Okay, so.
All right, you got a few more?
Yeah, I want to thank everybody for your participation. This isn't easy. And apparently there's a reminder slide. Yeah, so thank you all again for your continued participation. The next RAC is 5 January 24th, 2024, here in this room, from 1 to 5 p.m. The last thing I want to say is I want to thank Jerry for his service to the state of Oregon. He's retiring after 36 plus years of service as a hydrogeologist, and we very much value his contributions. And I just want to say thank you and let you all know that he most likely won't be attending the RAC meetings after this, and he certainly won't be attending as a member of the department.
Here you can come as a member of the public, we appreciate it.
Yeah.
You already retired.
Thanks, everybody. And if you have thoughts on next agenda, don't feel free to reach out.
Thanks, John.